Hello. How's everybody doing? First of all, happy birthday to Friedrich Nietzsche. It is October 15th, the day Nietzsche was born. It's also the day that Foucault was born. So, out of all the people who were influenced by Nietzsche who happened to share a birthday with him, turns out it's Foucault. so, you know, that could be either to your chagrin or maybe you're a Foucault fan. I like Foucault. He's got his problems, but, you know, separate the art from the artist, people, you know? That being said, I don't necessarily believe you can separate the art from the artist, as they say, or separate the creative from what they create, at least insofar as even if I'm trying to think of a way to say this. Let's take it away from Foucault because he has some really nasty allegations surrounding him, right? But one of the things I've talked about before on the podcast is just that artists are generally kind of self-centered people. If not necessarily narcissistic, you have to be kind of selfish to be involved in the arts because you have to prioritize yourself and your own creativity and your own time, oftentimes above, you know, interacting with other people, social obligations, things like that. There are forms of art where you do interact with other people. I mean, I'm in a band, so that obviously involves others, but like just thinking about me personally, like the amount of time that I've had to devote to music that takes away from my personal relationships, from my marriage. That's time I could be spending doing that. This is just all a way of saying like, so is like if selfishness is an inherent part of being an artist, right? It's not necessarily that you should separate the art from the artist, but if artists in general are like narcissistic and selfish people, maybe that's part of something we would normally consider a flaw is also part of the reason why they create the things that they do. Um, so it's like another way of saying that Voltaire quote, error has its merits too, or as Nietzsche says, we should not be ungrateful to um, those errors. I believe it's at the preface of Beyond Good and Evil. I quote it all the time, where Nietzsche's talking about not being ungrateful to Platonism, which is something that he says he's at war with, he's in a struggle with. But so it's like we shouldn't be ungrateful to the ways that artists are bad people. So long digression at the beginning of the stream, but yeah. So we'll get going here. I wanted to say before, I didn't really have a topic today. I just wanted to go, do a live stream because it's always fun. And I've got a tour coming up. I'm leaving with my band on Thursday. And I decided to take this week off from doing like regular Nietzsche podcast episodes. And I was like, well, I got to give everybody some kind of content this week. So I was like, I'll do another live stream. And that way it's like a nice send off before we go tour the Midwest. And it's about to be it's probably, I bet the leaves are already changing colors up there. It's going to be a really nice time to go tour in the Midwest. I like driving through that part of the country. So we're going to go to a lot of like smaller college markets and stuff like that and play a bunch of smaller shows because that's the level we're at. But I'm very excited. And so this will be a little send off for that. I did ask the patrons before, like a couple days ago, what they wanted me to talk about. I'm figuring I'm just going to answer questions from the audience and kind of just riff on things. But, unfortunately, one of the things that people ask me about is something that I feel like I end up talking about every live stream, but it just lines up that way. And I'm about to say two words that are going to make some of you excited to hear me talk about this hobby horse again. And some of you are probably going to like roll your eyes and be like, oh God, this again. But Jordan Peterson was just on Lex Friedman recently, like 5 days ago or something like that. And they did the reason why it's like I kind of have to bring it up is because they talked about Nietzsche extensively, and he just did that lecture series on Nietzsche. And I haven't seen his lecture series on Nietzsche. I think you have to pay for it. But I kind of wondered because it was about Beyond Good and Evil, and I'm like, is Peterson really going to delve deeply into what Nietzsche actually says in Beyond Good and Evil? And then I went and I watched those clips on Lex Friedman, and I was like, oh no, he's literally just repeating the same things the same errors that he's been making about Nietzsche from the beginning. Lex Friedman asks him, what about Nietzsche's allegation that Christianity is slave morality? And Jordan does not answer the question. He pivots away and he says, yeah, that's really tough. I actually think that the modern woke movement is what slave morality is. It's like, okay, maybe that's true. That has absolutely nothing to do with whether Christianity is slave morality. And then he goes on to say the line that or the common line that, oh, Nietzsche just didn't like the all too nice strains of mainstream Protestantism. And then he says an outright falsehood that Nietzsche never criticized the deep ideas of Christianity as such, or however he puts it. He never criticized Christ, which is not true. You can read the Antichrist where he does. Maybe Jordan doesn't read it as a criticism, but when he says that Jesus has an instinctive hatred of reality and that this comes from a physiological weakness, what Nietzsche's actual argument is that the kind of person who would deny the world, because that's Nietzsche's interpretation of Jesus, essentially. I've talked about this like a long time ago on the podcast, but it's really interesting. So this actually hits something else a patron asked me to talk about, because they were like, "Can you talk about Alan Watts?" And one of the things I noticed, I used to be a huge fan of Alan Watts. I mean, I guess I still am. Who isn't? And Alan Watts gave a very interesting lecture about Jesus and his religion. I believe that's what it's called on YouTube. If you look up Jesus and his religion, Alan Watts, you'll find it. And I had heard that Alan Watts had read Nietzsche, but it was sort of like Carl Jung or even Sigmund Freud, sometimes minimized or would downplay the influence of Nietzsche on his thought, or he would say like, yeah, I did read him, but I reject him in many ways. To my knowledge, that's things that people have said about Alan Watts, like in his personal life. I don't recall him ever mentioning Nietzsche, but his interpretation of Jesus is basically the same, that Jesus was like, I'm trying to think of the line, things like the kingdom of heaven is within you, that Jesus is an immanentist, is the term in religious studies, I guess, or theology. He believes in the immanence, the immediacy of the kingdom of God, like in everyone at all times. And, of course, this appeals to like the Buddhists or the, uh, you know, fans of Eastern religion, because it would seem to kind of place Jesus within the milieu of, those who would say, sort of like in Zen and certain forms of Buddhism, where they're like, you're already liberated right now, right? Insofar as you are not liberated, it's because of your attachments. But that's a choice you're making. If you were to let go of those attachments, you could find liberation in the here and now, right? That's sort of the big changeover from like Theravada Buddhism to Mahayana, is that rather than, because the Theravadians would say you have to like enter the stream, and then you have like 4 more lifetimes when you can get liberation. Whereas the Mahayanists are like, you can get liberation in the here and now. The Zen stories are full of people getting enlightenment, who have never studied Buddhism at all, and a Zen master like slaps them, and suddenly they attain like a Buddha nature. It's all very ridiculous. A lot of the Zen records are basically like slapstick comedy. So anyway, that's how Watts interprets Jesus, and it's how Nietzsche interprets Jesus. He's saying you can be imminently liberated in the here and now because you're a child of God. God is within you. This is an unreal world of sin and suffering. And Nietzsche advances the argument that the kingdom of heaven is not something to be sought after in an afterworld after death. Jesus lives in the immediate denial of the reality that's around him. Whatever you think of that interpretation, the interesting thing is that Watts is basically on the side of saying, look, Jesus was perhaps enlightened. Like, I'm all for this. Whereas Nietzsche says, this is evidence of like a physiological weakness or fragility in Jesus, that he's the kind of person who is almost extraordinarily, like to a pathological degree. And the way he talks about like Socrates having like a monstrous inversion of his conscience and his instincts or something like that, where basically the voice that dissuades Socrates is his instinct, and his reason is what is creative, whereas in most other people it's reversed. And this is such, his reason is like swollen and grown to like these titanic proportions that it's almost monstrous. Nietzsche would say like Jesus had this similarly, like he had the kind of sensitivity of a soul who cannot bear to be touched at all. And there might be many such sensitive souls in the world, but Jesus is like the epitome of like the most sensitive soul, and he's so sensitive that therefore he invents this religion of a God of love, which is completely contrary to everything in the New Testament, and lives in this imminent denial of the actual world, that the kingdom of God is within you. So that's why Nietzsche says there was only one Christian and he died on the cross, because the people who adopted Christianity didn't have that same experience of the world that Jesus had. They adopted it as an ideology, as a Platonic ideal, essentially a laundering of Platonism into a popular religious form. And that's what Jesus represents to Nietzsche. So in light of that, I mean, is that a criticism of Jesus? I mean, Nietzsche, he talks about these things in description oftentimes. He's not usually saying, and that's bad. He's not trying to hold your hand. But I would say that reading or that understanding of Jesus is anathema to 99.9% of believing Christians and their interpretation of Jesus. And he, in fact, does not say, um, you know, like, I'm all for Jesus, but I'm against the Christians who took up for what Jesus said or something of that nature. If anything, he says, the problem, and this is also in the Antichrist, is when he says the religion of the slave morality, which he explicitly ties to Christianity, left the domain of like the Roman slave class and the underclass and spilled over into what he calls hard, cruel northern men, basically Franks and Teutons and people like that, that Christianity ruined them. It wasn't that they were bad people. He says Christianity took their inherent cruelty and turned it inward and redirected it so that they were became cruel against themselves, essentially. And again, whatever you might think of that description, it's very hard for me to take it seriously if somebody says something like, when people say like a bland sort of like vague generalized remark of the nature of, Je Nietzsche never criticized Jesus, he criticized certain institutional strains of Christianity. That's just where are you getting this from the text? That sounds like something you're saying based on what you've heard about Nietzsche. And I have a hard time believing that Peterson hasn't even read Nietzsche, but could he really have the bravado to teach a whole course on Beyond Good and Evil without having read the book? Is that possible? Um, and then, like other clips I've seen from that podcast, because I don't think I'd be able to sit through the whole thing. Like, we're doing a Halloween stream, and this is truly horrifying stuff, guys. Like, you should be terrified by the fact that millions of people are watching this stuff. If you're any fan of Nietzsche, I guess that gives me a career. That gives me work to do, disabusing people of all of this stuff. But he goes on to say, he's talking about the framing that he always uses, that Nietzsche said we have to be able to create our own values because we cannot get our values from the transcendent sources anymore. He goes on to make this argument about how being has an ethic which is baked into it or woven into it. I forget exactly how he puts it. And he means being with a capital B, like the way Heidegger would talk about being. That being itself, existence itself, has a sort of moral or sort of structure to it, and that your own personal ethic therefore should reflect that structure or something of that nature. And initially when I heard it, I was like, that's not Nietzschean, that's Kantian. But I'm not even sure if that's necessarily Kantian, because it seems almost like a noumenal sort of claim. Like, I don't know if Kant would actually be down for like, he might think that was like too far of a leap, that in fact we need to use reason, even within the limited fashion that we're able to use reason, to make deductions about how we should act. We can't be like following these intuitions about the structure of being or something like that. Heidegger, that's kind of like an open question whether it compares to Heidegger, but it's not Nietzschean. No matter what it is, I don't know exactly what it is, but the viewpoint that he's putting forward, and I guess Peterson would say, I intend this as a critique of Nietzsche. This is me saying why Nietzsche is wrong. But the fact that he seems to be like unable to get his mind out of that framework throws serious doubt on whether he's qualified to teach Nietzsche at all. Because in order to teach Nietzsche to people, you need to be able to get out of all of your moral gunk that you believe in, all of the beliefs that you think are verboten or boundary lines that you think your thought can't cross. It doesn't mean you have to self-identify with Nietzsche and believe everything he says, but you need to be able to like speak. You need to be able to put yourself into the perspective of Nietzsche and ask yourself sincerely, what would Nietzsche think of this? And I do not see how you could read the Antichrist and not understand that Nietzsche is directly criticizing Christianity as a form of slave morality. So, somebody just asked in the chat, why didn't you do this on Halloween? Well, maybe I will also do it on Halloween, and it'll just be a misnamed stream. It'll be Halloween stream to Electric Boogaloo. No, but it's also Nietzsche's birthday, so there's that too. Everyone, if you missed the very beginning of the stream, today is Nietzsche's birthday. So happy October 15th, happy Nietzsche Day. And look at that, 160 something years later, Nietzsche is still important enough that mainstream public intellectuals are out there representing him. And somebody says Peterson is infatuated with a caricature of Nietzsche. Yeah, he's infatuated with. So what people like Peterson do, there's actually a great quote from Nietzsche about this. I believe it's in Wanderer and His Shadow, where he says that the worst readers behave like plundering troops, that they basically raid the text for treasure that they can use. And then they, in their plunder, they despoil the whole and do violence to the text in doing so. And that's the impression that I get, that he has a worldview that he's assembled from all these different sources. And when he reads a text, he's looking for the things that reinforce or that can be incorporated into that worldview. It's like the Borg, right? They don't assimilate everything about a species. They're like, what do I take that aids the project of perfection that I'm aimed at, and discard the rest, right? And so, you could say it's just cherry picking or quote mining or salad bar approach to a text or philosophy or something like that. But I think he does it consciously, though. I think he is very consciously aware of the fact that he will take works from all over the spectrum, like psychology, philosophy, history, and it's already sort of like it's approached from the perspective that he's already created. He's reasoning backwards from conclusions. Is it's the most common. I don't really know if you would. There's all sorts of logical fallacies that we could talk about, but however they approach it, whatever fallacious way they approach it, that's the problem with 99% of arguments that go astray, is that they've started from a conclusion and then they're reasoning backwards to how do I get there. So yeah. Before we move on, let me see if I had patrons ask me anything else about Jordan Peterson other than, they also, the person who asked about the Lex Friedman podcast, the patron that asked about that says, on a side note, what are the odds that Lex occasionally listens to the Nietzsche podcast? He seems to casually reference Nietzsche in almost every episode. You are both in Austin. True. Maybe you'll be a future guest on the show. Maybe so. If I run into Lex at the bar or out jogging or hiking the Greenbelt, I'll be like, hey, you should have a real Nietzsche expert come on your podcast sometime. But yeah, let's see. Let's look at the chat a little bit. Peterson is the perfect example of a hero who can turn into a villain. He is, somebody named Fisher King on X, Twitter, was saying, they were like describing what Peterson's doing and the way he dresses now, where like his clothes, his suits have all these like religious images, almost like he's like wearing religious medallions. He's adorned himself with like icons, and he basically said, it's a real, forget how he put it, but basically it's like a real slap in the face that he's out there dressed like a clown while doing a disservice to a thinker who is like astronomically more intelligent than he is. So yeah, Peterson's just a nominal Christian, says Diana Stevens. And somebody named Llama says, would you have Ken Geems on your podcast? I'd love to have Ken Geems on the podcast, actually. I've never tried to reach out to him, but I remember listening to some of his lectures a long time ago, and yeah, like he's one of those where I could tell, like, okay, you get this, you understand this material. He actually helped me along with some of my interpretation. It's not like things that I didn't know, but one of the best things about reading secondary literature is um, getting a hold of other people's hermeneutical techniques, right? So Ken Geames talks about the way that previous religious systems, I believe it was from him where I got the phrase enchant the world. So, you can say in long form that Nietzsche tells us the ways in which a religious system provided a metaphysical understanding of the reason for being, the reason for existence, provides a moral framework. In Will to Power, Nietzsche talks about the advantages that Christianity has provided for us. Let me look it up. Actually, I've got some of these quotes like pulled up recently. Let me see here. He says, or these are from my notes, but it's got quotes from Will to Power number 4, the note in Will to Power number 4, where Nietzsche says the advantages of the Christian moral hypothesis are: 1, it granted man absolute value; 2, made evil appear full of meaning; 3, posited that man had knowledge of values; 4, prevented man from despising himself as man, from taking sides against life. And then he basically concludes by saying that the Christian morality was an antidote against, quote, practical and theoretical nihilism. But then if you cross-reference that with, say, uh, Will to Power number 54, Nietzsche writes, quote, virtue has been taught as mortification of the self, pity, even the negation of life. All of these are the values of the exhausted. Uh, and then, also the numerous quotes in Antichrist, like Christianity has waged a war to the death against this higher type of man. It just put the deepest instincts of life under its ban, things like that. The reason why I quote all those second things is because this is very different from how Peterson would talk about the way Nietzsche would describe uh, the things that Christianity did for us, right? He doesn't describe it categorically as a good thing and the death of God as a lamentable occasion that we all need to like fall down and weep and gnash our teeth about. There were positive elements. I mean, he literally says advantages to the Christian worldview, but it's poisoning us at the same time, right? So is that good or bad? Well, it's both, right? Like if you absolutely needed something, like if it's between this and perishing, but it's slowly poisoning you, well, maybe that was right at that time, at that place in that time. But maybe you need to get over that worldview because in the long term, you see that it's going to lead you to nihilism. And Nietzsche does think that even though Christianity safeguarded us from practical and theoretical nihilism, as he says there, it's like an incomplete nihilism. And that's a very deep topic. He basically thinks we need to complete the nihilism by completely clearing away the old values, right? And clearing the ground. So that's all a way of saying, like, you can, as a shorthand, say Christianity enchanted the world, rather than going into this whole paragraph of detail of like it made evil meaningful, it kept man from despising himself, right? It was a way of, I mean, frankly, you could say it was a coping mechanism of how man was able to, understand and deal with the realities of the suffering of nature, the samsaric nature of existence, we might say. So making evil meaningful, what does that mean? Well, it means, you know, uh, the fact of like the problem of evil has been debated so much. So that is a point of contention. That's like a bruise that the atheists will press into. But at the same time, if you just sort of accept the contradictions of the problem of evil as a kind of holy mystery, or you accept the idea that it's like all free will or something like that, God needs to give us free will, so he has to allow for evil, or whatever the explanation might be, then yeah, when you have a hardship, you can kind of like look to the story of Job, right? And be like, well, maybe this is teaching me something. Maybe I need to endure this and see that, my love of God can't just be, the pagan love of God, you might say, was transactional insofar as you kind of have an arrangement with the gods where it's like, I do something for you, you do something for me. The gods can still be capricious. They might not honor your sacrifices, but there's still like kind of an expectation that if you're worshiping the gods, they're going to allow you to materially prosper, right? Whereas I guess we do have that idea in Christianity, but it's a very recent idea, like prosperity gospel and things like that. I would say historically, the way that Christianity, the way it enchanted the world that Nietzsche was talking about, is that people could deal with horrible hardships like natural disasters or my son got killed in war, and you could kind of comprehend all that within a framework of meaning that allows you to not just be like, oh my God, it's all just meaningless suffering, right? Um, a lot of these themes are talked about in, True Detective would be like an example, right? You have Martin Hart, one of the detectives who's Christian, and that's sort of like his way of coping with everything in the world. And then the character who doesn't have any kind of explanatory, metaphysical, moral framework, any enchantment of the world for dealing with anything, is like an abject pessimist, Rust Cole, who thinks, this is all just like a giant ghetto floating in space, right? It's all just a meat grinder. Um, and so that would be sort of like, Nietzsche's argument. Anyway, Ken Geames gave me that very helpful sort of, I guess it's not a mnemonic, but shorthand. And so that's like really the benefit of reading secondary literature, is you can understand, or you can pick up ways of communicating these ideas that are really, really helpful. Somebody says, oh, hey, Paul Lazar is here. He's an actor. Have you read any of Anne Carson's adaptations of Greek dramas? I really like her version of Heracles. I have not. I guess in the chat, if you've heard of Anne Carson, let me know. I got a super chat. I'd like to hear your thoughts on tech bros and their philosophies regarding tech. People like Teal or Palmer Luckey. Palmer Luckey, is that a real person? It sounds like a fictional character to me. Can we confirm, chat, is this real? Is Palmer Luckey a real person? Let's just look him up really quick. American entrepreneur. I don't like this guy's face. Founder of Oculus. I've never used Oculus. I don't know. I hear a lot about it, and I don't really know. I'm not really in that world. But I know who Peter Thiel is, right? Financier, big tech financier. He's a money guy, right? Or an investor. He's not really a tech entrepreneur or inventor. Oh, Chase says he's real. I figured he was real. I'm just gonna, that name, dude. Palmer Luckey. Come on. What are my thoughts on them, on their philosophies regarding tech? I don't really know about his philosophy regarding tech. I mean, I know that Thiel is like, people will say he's far right. I think from my reading of him, he seems just like a standard neoliberal type guy who's read some Dark Enlightenment stuff and read some NRX stuff. But I don't really know. I have to say, whenever I see the only like big tech guy I've seen talk, who seemed to have like interesting philosophical thoughts, was Mark Andreessen. Okay, somebody says Teal talks about Girard's meme stuff. Really interesting. Yeah. Okay. Maybe so I have heard that about Peter Thiel, that he actually like knows things regarding philosophy, political philosophy, and obscure esoteric philosophy, and is in that kind of NRX set. I guess it's like he's supposed to, he's supposed to be spooky. Somebody says he's supposed to be friends with Curtis Yarvin, right? So yeah, maybe that's what you're referring to, that kind of whole ideology. I mean, that would be, yeah, if you took the Curtis Yarvin ideology and you put it in the hands of a tech bro, which a lot of those guys are really the people that Yarvin's talking about, being sort of like, how would I put it? The kinds of people that he thinks should be running society, because it's like what Neocameralism, where you just have like this weird, it's like this weird reconciliation between anarchism and monarchism, where you just abolish the state, and then it's just sort of like a feudalist society, but instead of the state or whatever that you're living under being run by uh Baron so and so of Luxembourg or whatever, it's run by John so and so, chief executive officer of X corporation, right? Or whatever it might be. And the idea would basically be, what is the difference that people on the, like, I think this is actually directly from the Dark Enlightenment, where they say people on the left want a voice, whereas people on the right want the ability to exit. So, people on the left within their current system would like to have the power to change it or reshape it according to popular will, the voices of the people within it, whereas people on the right would like the chance to opt out. Like, I'll just leave and I'll pick another one, right? Of these sovereign sort of corporate fiefdoms or whatever they are. So it'd be all exit and no voice would basically be the ideal society of a Peter Thiel, if I'm understanding him right. And it's never going to happen because the the federal government enjoys the level of power that they have. And people on the left will say, well, they're run by the corporations and the billionaires. There is a strange relationship of cooperation and competition between them. And there's less of a distinction between the corporate world and the government than you think there is. And having some sort of body that is a monopoly on violence, I think most powerful people enjoy having that there. I don't think the dream of balkanizing the United States into a bunch of corporate fiefdoms would actually find purchase among a lot of the aristocracies, because what do aristocracies always do? They want to have a state that enforces and defends their claims. The state mostly exists for the sake of the aristocracy, so why would they want to abolish it? That's sort of the main problem I have with like the whole anarcho-libertarianism thing, is that it just doesn't. It's like you want the leftist goal of complete total like anarchy, like a classless, moneyless society. It would be the ultimate end of like Marxism, but you want to do it like you want this strange mishmash of left-wing and right-wing values. It doesn't really work. Like traditionally, the state exists for the sake of the aristocracy, but I don't know. Americans never really understand that, because we see the market and the state as like somehow fundamentally opposed to one another, when in fact they create one another and enhance one another and need one another. And so I don't know to what extent I even understand Peter Thiel's actual ideology. I'm sure people can correct me on that. So yeah, somebody says, I'm just going to read random comments here because there's been a lot of them. I'm looking for something that's actually like a question on the current topic, if anyone's extending a discussion of the topic. Doesn't look like it. Okay. Have you seen the Napoleon movie yet? No. I don't know why they cast an old Napoleon. I don't know why they cast, like, yeah, Joaquin Phoenix should have played Napoleon 20 years ago when he looked like he did when he was playing Commodus in Gladiator. But that was beyond me. I thought they would like maybe de-age him when he was younger or something like that. I don't know. It seemed like just yet another iteration in this project of films that kind of have to deconstruct anything that was larger than life, or uh, you know, like the average modern person can't understand the appeal of going and like building a continent-wide empire just for the sake of doing it, right? For your own self-aggrandizement. We would regard that as being vain and imperialistic and wasteful. But that is really, I think, what drives Napoleon, right? And so you have to get into that mindset if you want to understand Napoleon. And we're always trying to, make the great men, so to speak, just like us secretly deep down. So Napoleon must have been, really just driven by jealousy over his wife cucking him all the time, something like that. It kind of takes him and makes him petty. So again, that's as somebody who hasn't seen the movie, but I've like read about what's in it, and I'm like, okay, I don't think this is really for me. I'm at the point in my life, guys, where I don't watch things that I know are going to be bad. I just don't have time. I have too much reading to do. I have too much work to do on the podcast. And I yeah, like I'm not going to hate watch something, and I'm not even like, there are things that you see where you're like, "Oh, that could be good," but I just don't know. No, I have to hear that it's great. Like I don't have the time to spend on like slop these days. And I can see, it's like normally I might give something like that by Ridley Scott a chance, but I was just like, "Nah, I don't want to." Um Ryan Young says, I think his main insight was the distribution of state power to many centers actually makes the state grow paradoxically. We don't have a voice anyway, and it's all just a show. I actually agree with all of that. Um, well, I don't necessarily agree with the first one, the distribution of state powers to many centers, because that it really matters what you mean, like quantitatively, not qualitatively, like quantitatively. Because having, like, I think having several centers of power when there's like 5 of them is a check on state power. If you have like if you have roughly equal power, maybe the state's a little more powerful, right? They have the lion's share of the power, but you have checks in the form of the church and guilds and families and dynastic interests and things like that. And you have like a social morality that everyone abides by or something like that. Maybe we don't really have institutions for securing social morality, but that would have existed in ancient Rome in the form of like censors and stuff like that. I don't know if there's really a good example, but if you have like a couple like major checks on power that maybe together all of them can sort of like steer the ship of state or nudge it in a different direction, I think that can be a check on state power. Yeah, just having like everything be atomized to where there are no meaningful checks on state power. It's just a bunch of like atomized individuals and communities, quote unquote. Jung talks about this in The Undiscovered Self, the problem of zeros stacking up, not equaling a one, right? If that's the situation, yeah, I think that would grow state power, paradoxically. Somebody asked, I just started watching, are you talking about Yarvin? Yeah, somebody asked me about Peter Thiel's ideology, and I was like, searching the data banks in my brain. I'm like, what is he supposed to believe? Oh, he's a Yarvin guy, right? Um, and yeah, that's what I think about. Is it's impractical because it actually goes against the interests of the very people who it's supposed to benefit. Do you think Nietzsche will regard each Elon Musk as a Ubermensch? Well, I don't know if Nietzsche will do that. I actually doubt it because he's dead. Um, but no, Nietzsche wasn't into the businessman thing. That's kind of the issue. Maybe he would have changed his mind if he was alive today. Maybe he'd have a different opinion. Maybe he'd be like, this is where all the vigor and risk taking is in the entrepreneur. But in general, in his actual writings, given what he saw and what he experienced and what he perceived at his particular time, he kind of thought most politicians and business owners are just like average people, or like even if they're extraordinary in a set of skills, they're extraordinary in these skills that basically the Greeks would have thought are like slave skills. So you're like really extraordinary at like balancing your books, and you're really extraordinary at like social, like putting on a false face and lying and deceiving people and lawfare and things like this. And would he have changed that opinion today? I don't really know. I really don't like those questions that are like, what would Nietzsche think of this? Because inevitably, I don't know. No one knows, especially when you're asking about things that involve technological and social developments that he couldn't have possibly been aware of. And it's just, it's going to end up inevitably like just reflecting my opinion, I guess. Uh, it's like, I don't know. I guess I understand why people ask it, but I don't like questions like that because it's too much. Like, Nietzsche is so multifaceted in the way he thinks, and almost every perspective he puts forward, he can articulate, like, if not an opposing perspective, like a different angle to it. I'm starting up the gay science read through for book 2 right now, and like going and getting it back into the meat of the primary sources and reading these. And you just see so many of these passages have this form where the first paragraph is saying sort of like, here are all the downsides of this phenomenon, but look at the way in which this phenomenon has done this, and shouldn't we be grateful for that? And so that's always what's going through my head when I'm thinking about what would Nietzsche think about X. And it's like you're asking me to like come down on one side or another when Nietzsche usually doesn't come down on one side or another. Do you recommend Walter Kaufman's biography? Yeah, you should read Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist by Walter Kaufman. It's not the be all end all of Nietzsche interpretation. He says some things that I would regard as incorrect, um, but he makes his arguments very well. He's not incorrect like in a way of like being factually incorrect about the text. Um, he leaves some things out in his interpretations, we'll say. But like if you haven't read, like if you're just getting into Nietzsche and you want to kind of understand, like especially understanding Nietzsche's positions on like Socrates and Jesus, and understanding like the whole development of Nietzsche's thought. That's really the most important thing about Kaufman's book is I, you know, you can sit down and read individual Nietzsche books, but he lays it out from start to finish, the questions Nietzsche is concerned with at each period in his life and how he addresses those questions, and how one sort of stage of his thought leads to the next, and the logic of development, and what was going on in Nietzsche's life and the backdrop of his life as his thought developed. So I think it's like an excellent book. You can supplement it after that and read other secondary materials, but I think that you know especially if you just want some sort of secondary source, that's a great one. I think also Curtis Kate wrote a great biography about Nietzsche that's helpful. There's also Charlie Hoynemann's book, which I've brought up in the on the podcast in the past. There's also Klosowski interprets Nietzsche, Deleuze, Heidegger. A lot of people interpret Nietzsche. Okay. I think Thiel is intentionally murky with his economic philosophy so he can appeal to based and red-pilled libertarian types. I mean, that's probably true. I mean, I think, that's maybe this will take me off a little digression, but that's why we're here. This whole live stream is a giant digression. A lot of the current political discourse is not a discourse. It's there are certain it's content, really. A lot of the current like political posturing and the tribes people put themselves in, and the sub-tribes within the sub-tribes that people put themselves in. It really reminds me of like a genre of music and subgenres of music. And maybe that's more pronounced with the kind of music I'm familiar with, which is heavy metal, because in heavy metal there's like different styles of dress associated with different subgenres, and then like different life philosophies associated with them, and like different just overall aesthetics, right? And so, a satanic black metal band has like a really um, pronounced, distinctive aesthetic to the way they dress and look, and the kind of ideology they're going to espouse, and like what their album cover art is going to look like, and what their logo is going to look like, and all of that, right? And so you can kind of like you can see just from a glance, if you were to go to pull up the Instagram page of that kind of band and you didn't have the genre, right? You could probably quiz me and be like, is this a stoner metal band or a sludge metal band or a black metal band? And most of the time you'd be able to tell. There'd be a couple bands like Party Cannon where you see their logo, you'd be like, that doesn't really fit. But overall, you'd probably be able to see the like family resemblance. A lot of like the political sub tribes are doing the same thing. If you go through somebody's X account and you flip through it and it's all Greek statues and it's all like quotations from Xenophon and Thucydides, and like posts about like you can, without even seeing the ideas that they, or the opinions that they espouse, you can kind of tell, like you catch a certain vibe and you're like, okay, you're like one of those vitalist right people. Or if you go on someone's page and it's all like communist stuff and renditions of the Internationale and pictures of Mao, and quotations from obscure like Marxist theory and stuff like that. Again, you can imagine like the imagery and the aesthetic. You could sort of catch all that and clock all that without reading any of the content, and you'd know exactly where that person stands. And in both of these, like you can subdivide it, right? So there's like, I remember I was on a philosophy server a long time ago on Discord, and there's one guy who was like obsessed with like what was his name? Öcalan, like this Kurdish communist. He was like the head of like the Kurdish like communist brigades or whatever. Like the communists will get really into that, where they're like, I'm really into this specific thread of like third worldist thought, or like Murray Bookchin or something like that. And you see the same thing on the right. And you know, it happens with libertarians too. It happens with all these ideologies. So what's my point here is that, yeah, like appealing to, I guess what I'm saying is like Peter Thiel's appeal to the based and red pilled bros, or however libertarian people that you're talking about, I think that that's an aesthetic. It's like a brand. It's a way of creating content that will appeal to certain people, right? Um, like if you think about a lot of these things just in terms of content creation and the branding, um, that explains like 90% of what's going on. Like it's the same thing. Like a lot of what you people do who are obsessed with political debates online and your political affiliation online is really the same thing that like, a chick on Etsy scrolling looking for pictures of a cozy autumn. She's like, "Oh, these pictures, the vibe that this person's talking about and these quotes and these pictures make me feel a certain way. And I'm consuming content to feel that way." And, I'm not saying that there's nothing beyond that. I'm not saying there's no real world consequences or anything to this. I'm just saying 90% of the discourse is not a discourse. It's like it's people just getting together and vibing on this certain, like, I like the Greek statue vibe, right? And the vast majority of it will not affect anything in the world. The vast majority of it is just like content being fed to you. And, you know, uh, that's just how it goes. I don't fault Peter Thiel for doing that. Hans Georg Moeller, his channel, Carefree Wandering, I definitely recommend it. Everyone who subscribes here, you'll enjoy Professor Moeller's content. And he believes basically your public profile is like your identity in the modern age. That's like our technology for identity creation. And a lot of it is just part of that game, is building a public profile that will like appeal to certain people the same way that like if you're making a dream pop album, you're like, what are all the aesthetics that we have to hit that are going to appeal to that audience to grow the audience within that niche? We can't put out an album that looks like a black metal album cover. That would alienate all these people, right? And so he knows who his fan base is and he's kind of like appealing to them. And I'm sure he benefits by having a large public profile. You can get a lot of things done by having a large public profile. Not all tech pros do, right? But he clearly does. And most people do have delusions that they're like preaching, like they're somehow guiding the zeitgeist and steering like the cultural like consciousness in a certain direction. And maybe they are, but I'm very skeptical about the degree to which the cultural consciousness is effective in changing material reality. Um, okay, let's see here. Thoughts on Nietzsche and masks. Well, the mask is a really interesting sort of metaphor, I guess, from Beyond Good and Evil. Insofar, it's really hard to talk about actually because you have to. Um, it's one of those critiques, I guess, or maybe putting it as a critique is even the wrong way to put it. It's a statement that Nietzsche makes about philosophy in general that also includes himself, and in including himself, it kind of creates like a little paradox. And what I mean by that is, um, he would say that basically every philosopher thus far, it doesn't just apply to philosophers, but we'll stick with philosophers for the sake of clarity, has worn a mask insofar as they their philosophy has been the delivery system for the germ of an idea, the moral or immoral germ of an idea of whatever their internal morality aims at. And the reason why it's a mask is for the same reason that James Burnham talks about in his book, The Machiavellians, about the formal versus the real meaning. So formally, Dante Alighieri, like in the text De Monarchia, is making an argument for why, like, having a universal uh, what would we say, universal, like religiously sanctioned Christian empire is a good idea. And he makes all of these philosophical and theological arguments for why. That's the formal meaning. The real meaning, which has nothing to do with those arguments, is that he had taken a particular side in a partisan struggle between the Guelphs and Ghibellines. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce those, but these two factions who were basically pro Holy Roman Empire versus pro Catholic Church, and Dante was more pro Holy Roman Empire, right? And so all the arguments that he advances that are like rooted in scripture for why we need to have this universal Christian empire are actually a mask for the true intention that perhaps he doesn't even realize is, what we might say, that he's doing something disingenuous, right? Um, he just knows that this is the right thing to do. This is the right interpretation of scripture, and it just so happens to align with what advantages him, or what lines up with his personal advantage, right? And I think that happens quite a bit. The reason why it becomes somewhat paradoxical in Nietzsche, when Nietzsche is telling us this, is because the whole chapter in the beginning of Beyond Good and Evil, he's been sort of like peeling away the mask from all of these philosophers and saying, what pride there was behind, Kant's discovery of synthetic judgments a priori. What malice was there behind Epicurus, this supposedly, you know, um, quaint and unassuming garden god, this man who just wanted to retreat to his garden with his students? How much hostility was there against Plato and the Platonic school in his writing? Perhaps Descartes did not actually doubt anything at all. Perhaps at the basis of his whole meditations was a demand for thinking to be made coterminous with being, right? And where does the germ of that idea come from? Well, that comes from the idea of the Christian soul. So Nietzsche's been tearing the mask away from all of these thinkers, saying the way that they're making this argument, it seems like it's an argument about, formal logic or something like that, but really it's coming from like a moral demand that this person is making on life. You can then apply that to Nietzsche and say, okay, this whole perspectivist project of peeling away the mask from all these philosophers, what moral demand of yours, Nietzsche, are you enforcing on the world by giving this whole framework? And I think that's why Nietzsche has some lines in there, like where he says, that the true philosopher only removes the mask when speaking to his students. So maybe we could say, I'm one of Nietzsche's students now that I'm reading his book. So he's being truthful to me. He's not wearing a mask with me. And you should know better than that. So let's do some super chats. Ever experienced the occult? Crowley was influenced by Nietzsche. Jung in his alchemical studies. I've experienced a bit and ended in the psych ward. Well, you certainly make it sound like a rollicking good time. I'd sure love to end up in the psych ward myself. So there's my how-to on that. Yeah, okay, I don't know what you mean by experience to the occult. I've never had a religious experience, if that's what you mean. I was very much into the occult for I mean, it's funny because the last sort of thing I was talking about was like black metal bands and their ideologies. I had a period when I was very much influenced in some of the currents of occultism that were promoted by bands in that milieu, like Gnostic, like I won't even go into it. Basically, Gnostic inspired ideologies that sort of all of it's really new agey in that they take they take ideas from all these different sources and kind of cobble them together, right? And New Age spirituality, occultism is sort of tailored to that kind of thing. It's sort of a build your own religion kit. And I think that's all great personally. Just, I had a couple years when I was very much reading. Yeah, I read Crowley's, some of his poems and some of his writings that were supposed to be, um, you know, revelations of these occult truths and things like that. Now, I will say, so I moved on from all that. Short answer. Like at a certain point, I was young. I was in my early 20s, and it was part of a lifestyle. And I realized at a certain point, I'm like, this is LARPing, because I hadn't had any religious experiences or mystical experiences. I met people who said they did. Um, people who'd said that they had encountered spirits and entities and things like that, or dissolved their self consciousness. But I didn't really. I never had any experience like that, and I moved on from it. It was actually my next step after that was Buddhism, and I spent like 5, 6 years doing Buddhism, and then like after that long nightmare was over, finally achieved wakefulness, and then I was like went back to Nietzsche, and I was like, oh yeah, the real world is where it's at. The real world is gorgeous and beautiful, and why would I spend my what little time I have while I'm here thinking about what's beyond it? Uh, and I mean, that's really was the main revelation. But so I never experienced the occult. I did read some Crowley. Jung and his alchemical studies, uh, highly recommend. Top notch stuff. Um, even if you just read it as purely psychological insights. I did first read a lot of that when I was very much into occultism, but even then, alchemy was always a hobby horse for me, not because I actually thought it would get me to any sort of metaphysical truth, but it's very hard to explain alchemy because it's very hard to understand alchemy. And there was nothing, it's one of the few things, like when I'm trying to explore this, like you can't just Google it and find out. Like this is, a lot of this is incredibly, it's not secret knowledge anymore because all these books have been published by Paracelsus and John Dee and Raymond Lull and all these old alchemists. But deciphering what they're saying is still difficult. If anything, you could say it's probably more difficult today than it ever has been because we still don't, or we don't any longer live in the same sort of like imminent religious symbolism that they lived in, if that makes any sense. Like there'd be religious allegories that they might draw on that a person of the period might pick up on a lot quicker. And just references to things. There's references in alchemical texts that we still have no idea what the hell they mean. Like in the one, there's this one metaphor of the Coruscant dog against the dog of Armenia. It's like a representation of the duality of man. There are two wolves within you, right? That's in an alchemical text, these two dogs. But if you try and look into like, well, what does the Coruscant dog represent and what does the dog of Armenia represent? And what you'll find is, well, these refer to like locations that place names for places, and we don't actually know what places they refer to. That knowledge is simply lost. So we don't really have any information about that. So it might even be more difficult to learn about a lot of the alchemical symbolism today. But I found it very rewarding, and I almost approach that more like detached and scientifically thinking about it, or empirically. I'm struggling to find the word. Like I wasn't looking into it thinking like, oh, this is the revealed truth of the universe. I was very interested in trying to understand what they believed and what they were doing exactly. And so just for the psychological insight, I recommend looking into Carl Jung's alchemical content, but I don't recommend occultism, and I've never had an occult experience. Another super chat. The Peterson God is dead interpretation is resurging. Is Nietzsche making a twofold statement, ultimately both a caution and an opportunity? Yeah, that's the short version. He is. I mean, the caution is that the average people, the vast majority of the human race, will experience this as a catastrophe. The Petersons of the world don't grasp that it's not a universal statement, that there actually are people who can create their own values. Peterson reasons, because I wouldn't be able to. No one can, right? That's what Jung is for. Jung is there to sort of, in this post-modern world, post-scientific enlightenment world, shepherd people back into the traditional religious structure by getting them to think about it a slightly different way, and basically be like, here's the cure for your angst with the transcendent falling apart in your hands. That's what he's an advocate for. But yeah, Nietzsche doesn't mean it as a lament. He doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's an inevitability. It's an inevitable eventuality that the Christian God will fade from widespread belief. And there's nothing you can do to, like, gods don't live forever, right? Contrary to what you may have heard. And so Nietzsche is just not the type of guy who will weep over an inevitability. He sees all things as necessary. Everything in the world is perfect. So, can everyone attain that level of amor fati? No. Quite simply, no, they can't. But Nietzsche's philosophy is not for everybody. And as long as Peterson teaches it like this is supposed to be for everybody, because that's one of his main failings. He writes how-to guides for life, how to live. He's in the self-help game. That's not what Nietzsche's doing. It's not self-help for the masses. So let's see here. It is a twofold statement, though. So this guy's saying, oh, wait a minute. Or is that a response to Carl? It is a twofold statement, though. Yeah, it's a twofold statement. I mean, yeah, it is a twofold statement. It's just not, it's not a danger and an opportunity for necessarily the same people. I mean, I guess you could say it's a danger for everyone insofar as the whole social structure collapsing and everyone losing faith and everything is going to be bad for everyone. Yes. But let's here, let me pull up another quote from Nietzsche. I just have these lying around. The condition of Europe in the next century will once again lead to the breeding of manly virtues because men will live in continual danger. So, I mean, most of us would say, oh, that sounds horrible. Nietzsche doesn't think that's horrible. He says to all those souls who are of any concern to me, I wish danger and hardship and self recrimination, danger in the alley and in the heart, and all of these things that basically will be a proving ground, a test for you on the one thing that matters in the modern age, whether one can endure. Yeah, this is the way he puts it. Sorry, I kind of like struggled through that, but it's from memory, guys. I'm not. One day I'm gonna have like the level of command of Nietzsche's quotations, like like a devoted Muslim has with the Quran. Well, I'll be able to like just chant whole verses from Nietzsche's canon perfectly, but not yet. So let's see. Let's go to another patron question. Okay, I'll just pick one at random here. This is from Ron. Thank you for your in-depth analysis, deeply thought out podcasts. Much appreciated and very encouraging for the future of media. Okay. I know you don't delve into current politics too much. Oh no, I picked the wrong comment. Okay. I think it would be interesting to hear your take on Steve Bannon, his philosophy. It's you know what, Ron? I'm sorry. I'm probably gonna pass. I don't know anything about Steve Bannon, and I don't know, like, I don't know. I don't even want to go into it. I think I've already talked too much about contemporary politics at the moment. So I am going to pass on that question just because I don't know. Or he says, would Nietzsche be opposed to the global system that Bannon is opposed to? Well, see, that's like, yes. Well, okay. Again, what do you mean by opposed to, right? Uh, Nietzsche would see many of the problems with the current global system, right? But I can't imagine him becoming like a political actor in the way that Steve Bannon is. Like that's beyond my imagination, because it is ultimately populist rage against like a global elite or aristocracy, and that's not the route that Nietzsche ever really wants to go. And I think you can set like a lot of people are opposed to the current global system, right? For various different reasons. So really the interesting thing is not that two people might happen to be opposed to the current global system. It'd be like on what basis and how do they approach that? And what is the nature of that opposition? What does that actually mean in practical terms? Somebody asked me the other day, they were like, are you opposed to the existence of Christianity? And I was like, no, what would that mean in practical terms? That's a belief that 1 billion people hold. What does it mean for me to be opposed to Christianity? Like sitting around fantasizing all the time about, oh, I wish this didn't exist. Well, that sounds like a waste of my time and my emotional energy. What are the practical ways that you would oppose Christianity? Joining ISIS? Excuse me. I'm not going to do that either. Like I I think a lot of the time it's like people will say I'm opposed to this, but nothing in their practical actions does anything to actually oppose it. And I would really wonder to what extent you would have to go to actually threaten to disrupt the global system. You know who is actually opposed to the global system? The Yemeni militias flying drones into like oil tankers and stuff, like trying to shut down ports and like affect global trade. That's who's opposed to the global system, right? And that's like in a practical, real way, they're opposed to it. Um, so I don't spend much time thinking about whether I'm for or against things that are beyond my power or control. Like, I can obviously, like, just as good as the next guy, dream up like what the ideal world would look like, but I'm not Plato. I'm not going to sit around thinking about that. And I'm more interested in like the reality that I actually affect in my life. And so like all of the projects and beautiful things in my life are all of like an artistic and creative nature. They're not of a political nature. I know for some people that's all they have, but you know, and I don't, yeah, I don't think Nietzsche would be very interested in a lot of these sort of concerns. I think that, yeah, I don't know. So let's find a different patron question. Nietzsche experience in the military and the influence upon his philosophy. That's an interesting question, actually. I don't know if I have an immediate answer for you. So for those of you who don't know, Nietzsche was a uh, he did like there was like mandatory military service, I think, if you were able-bodied, and so he went to the military academy. This would have been for Prussia, and he was apparently like a really good writer. I mean, at least according to Nietzsche himself, according to his letters to his friends, he said the commanding officers are very impressed with my ability to ride horses, and uh, blah blah blah. I'll make a splendid officer, right? And he learned, out there firing cannons and doing all these things. This is in, I believe, the 1860s. But he has an incident where, while getting onto a horse, his foot slips or something, he falls off, he breaks some ribs. It actually sounds like a really nasty injury, um, given the medicine at the time. And he never really fully recovered from that injury. Kind of similar to Mishima in some ways, right? Because Mishima was passed over by the Japanese army uh, during World War II because he didn't meet the physical requirements. And so then Mishima spends his whole life sort of like uh, uh, overshooting the physical requirements of the Japanese military significantly. Um, I don't know if there's something like that going on. I mean, a lot of people think it's like a compensatory sort of like behavior in the case of Mishima, but you could say like, okay, Nietzsche, his short stint in the military ends with a crippling injury, and he's already like kind of a, I don't want to say frail guy. He's not necessarily frail beforehand, but he is after this. Like it exacerbates all of the problems that he already has. And basically, yeah, he's like permanently damaged his chest and fucked up his breathing and shit. I think I just bumped the mic. And then after that, during the Franco-Prussian War, very short war, lasts, I think, a little under a year or a little over a year. It's like right around a year. Nietzsche volunteers for that as a battlefield nurse, which, that's a noble calling. It's not entirely like the glory of being a soldier, and then he gets sick right on the front because these sicknesses travel during uh, wartime, and he gets like diphtheria and I think dysentery. Like he gets two awful illnesses. So basically, both the times that Nietzsche spends in the military, he leaves with some sort of like serious ailment. And, you know, I don't really know if I can draw any conclusions about that, of the effect on his philosophy, other than just to repeat what I've said before, that you could sort of make a critique that a lot of his idealization of health, as he says in Ecce Homo, that our idols are ideals, and that where we find ideals, we find a want or a lack. And so, because he's lacking in health, Nietzsche kind of produces this ideal of health. But I'm not sure if that's necessarily like tied to the military. It almost seems to me like, you know, even after hurting himself the first time, he wanted to go back and volunteer during the war. And that's also kind of a strange incident because he doesn't really approve of the war. He didn't really approve of Germany attacking France because Nietzsche kind of was more favorable to the French. He thought this is like a great cultural civilization, and the Germans are a bunch of blockheads, and they're asserting their military dominance over the continent, and it could be to the detriment of the culture of Europe. So, it's difficult to say exactly. And, as far as Nietzsche's writings, there are a number of military metaphors of, especially in like Twilight of the Idols. That's where we get from the military school of life, that which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. So if we kind of take that sentiment, we might say that maybe Nietzsche learned that in the military. When he's saying in the military school of life, that was the school of life taught him that when he was in the military. That even though he's discharged with these injuries or ailments. Maybe he felt that made him stronger. Like that, the fact that he endured that, and like we could see Nietzsche as kind of like a Rudy type character. Non-Americans probably don't know what I'm talking about, but the movie Rudy, Rudy was Sean Astin, Samwise Gamgee. He wants to play pro football, but he's too small. But he's got heart. God damn it, he has heart, and he wins over the whole team. And they're practicing, and he's like playing like it's the damn Super Bowl, even though he's getting his ass kicked all the time because he's a tiny little dude. So maybe Nietzsche kind of took that lesson. Like, I did it even though I'm just congenitally a weak and frail person. I still did it. A weak and frail person. I still did it. And maybe there was kind of some idealization going on there, or like a compensatory ideal in the way he kind of describes his philosophy as like, I'm trying to think of the passage where it's like he's driven his guns and artillery onto the highest mountaintops and is firing from on high. That's how he's, like the meaning of uh, maxims and missiles. The first chapter of Twilight of the Idols. That like these are like artillery guns that Nietzsche's firing. That's the form that his aphorisms are taking. So yeah. Somebody, Ryan Young says, all the BS, none of the glory. That would suck. Yeah, exactly. That was Nietzsche's experience with the military. So yeah. How would one more ring affect LeBron's legacy? Man, I misread that. I thought you were asking how the one ring would affect LeBron's legacy at the beginning. And I was going to be very excited to answer that question. But yeah. Okay. Let's do a question from chat. Did Nietzsche contracted syphilis from his visit to a brothel? Okay. What's your name? Tupai King? Tupul King? I'm not exactly sure. No. And I actually have recently started on a video I'm making about that. I've been doing more short form videos. If you're a follower of the channel, then you're probably aware of that. I've addressed this in the past, but I was like, I need to make like a spiffy, concise video just specifically addressing the syphilis thing and put this baby to bed once and for all. And it won't be put to bed. This is, again, it's like a blessing and a curse because, there's people out there misrepresenting Nietzsche and saying myths and falsehoods that they probably don't even know are myths and falsehoods, but just repeating them about Nietzsche all the time. And as long as those people are all out there, I'll still have a job. But no, like the syphilis diagnosis is actually, I'm trying to think of like the best way to say this. It is almost impossible that Nietzsche had syphilis. The reason why people say Nietzsche had syphilis is because Nietzsche was not a tiny dude. Sorry, interjection. Somebody asked, was he a tiny dude? Rudy was a tiny dude. I meant that Nietzsche was actually pretty tall. It's just constitutionally, he was not very tough. And that probably has to do with his congenital illness, which we'll talk about in a second. So the syphilis diagnosis, there is a reason why people say it. It's not like there's no reason behind it. Nietzsche was diagnosed with pruritic syphilis when he was at the hospital at Jena. So a doctor made that diagnosis. Why would they say that? Well, about a quarter of European men would contract syphilis at some point in their lives during this time. Syphilis was really blowing up. And superficially speaking, Nietzsche's symptoms seemed to match syphilis. He had these crazy headaches that were like full-on migraines that would lay him out. And he seemed to have this sudden onset of insanity, right? And that's what happens with syphilitics. They have a period where they get these crazy headaches, and then they immediately lapse into like an insane state. And it begins with a kind of swelling up of these sudden grandiose ideas that weren't there before. So why couldn't it have been syphilis? Well, for one, Nietzsche's headaches started at age 9. So a 9-year-old Nietzsche didn't go to a brothel, right? These headaches were plaguing him his entire life. The other thing is that his father and younger brother died of a mysterious illness when Nietzsche was very young, when he was like 5 years old, and then a year later, at 6 years old, first his father and then his little brother died. And Nietzsche believed that he had some sort of congenital illness from his father. He writes about this in Ecce Homo, and he writes in his journals, "Any year could be my last." One of his worst years was the same year that when he was like 36, which was the age his father was when he died. Nietzsche had a terrible year, and it was the same thing, like headaches, dizziness, visual phosphenes. The thing is, syphilitics, when they have headaches, they last like a couple weeks or a couple months, and it precedes it precedes the collapse basically immediately. They don't have headaches for years at a time. So the doctors heard that symptom, and they didn't understand that this is something that Nietzsche's had as like a lifelong problem. Secondly, Arthur Muthmann, who was a psychiatrist at Basel, studied Nietzsche's journals from the time after his collapse, the Madman Nietzsche journals. And he concluded it was like nothing he had ever read by a syphilitic. And he actually said, I would go out on a limb and say the journals alone proved that he didn't have syphilis. But on top of that, Nietzsche could stick out his tongue without the tremor, which was like, if you can do that, you basically don't have syphilis. And even towards the end of his life, that never changed. And his condition, there was a guy who visited Nietzsche in 1899 and said, I think he can still be cured, right? And Nietzsche died the next year. But he just didn't show the normal course of like degeneration that a syphilitic would. The other thing is that most syphilitics were dead. Like once the major insanity kicked in, they were dead in a couple of years, like almost to a man. There was a series of like 244 patients that they studied who had paretic syphilis, Kraepelin's set of patients. And out of those 244, one lasted more than 10 years. One. So that would put Nietzsche in the 0.5% of syphilitics in terms of longevity, assuming that he contracted it like immediately before his collapse, because Nietzsche was alive like 11 years after that. So that's just, it makes the diagnosis highly implausible. And then when we look at the actual headaches that Nietzsche had, they're all on the right side of the head, behind the right eye. Syphilitics have headaches across the whole head. It's not localized to one region. So Leonard Sachs, he was a researcher who put forward the theory that what Nietzsche had was a meningioma, which was a tumor behind the right eye, a slow growing tumor on the optic nerve. And what that would do is effectively eventually lobotomize you. But in the meantime, you would have increasing headaches and you would see visual phosphenes, which is what Nietzsche reported. He would see, like, he's like, when I close my eyes, I see this profusion of fantastic flowers twining round one another. And it was actually when he told his friend, she reported, he said, don't you think this is a sign of incipient madness? That's as early as 1883. He's having visual phosphenes. His collapse is like 6 years later. So, and by the way, those are never reported in syphilitics. They don't have visual phosphenes. They don't have those kinds of hallucinations. They develop crazy ideas about the world, but or delusions or whatever, paranoid delusions, however it manifests, but they don't have these visual phosphenes. So Nietzsche clearly had some other condition. So Sachs puts forward the tumor theory. The theory that I think is more plausible is codicil. That's a congenital stroke disorder that basically would explain why Nietzsche's father died at 36, why his younger brother died. They both died after severe cramping, and then his father went blind, which Nietzsche, by the way, towards the end of his life, Nietzsche was functionally blind in his right eye, and his vision just got worse and worse to where like he wasn't blind, like he could still read, but his doctors were always telling him like, you're straining your eyes by reading so much, and it would actually kind of hurt him and bring on headaches by reading too much and having to focus like that. But like for most of Nietzsche's productive career, like if he lived today, he would not be issued a driver's license. He would not be allowed to drive a car. He was basically blind. He would like walk around with a parasol to shield his eyes from the sun. So what that points to, I think, given that his father also suffered from cramps, blindness, severe headaches, and then rapidly deteriorated and then died after a period of what they described as madness, and the attending physician called liquefaction of the brain, which is one of those kind of old style phrases that I love. If Nietzsche had a congenital illness, codicil, that he inherited from his father, this congenital stroke disorder, then his final collapse would just be explained as like another stroke. Like he had a series of strokes that would basically, again, effectively just bring on an early onset dementia. And that would make far more sense than the syphilis hypothesis. Um, so, for a variety of reasons, there's disconfirming evidence about the syphilis hypothesis. He could stick out his tongue without tremor. The madness doesn't appear to be similar to syphilis patients. The headaches are not evidence of syphilis. The visual phosphenes are contrary evidence to syphilis. His longevity as a patient doesn't make any sense with it being syphilis. The syphilis thing just doesn't make any sense. The only reason why people can point to say he had syphilis was a doctor made the diagnosis. But that's not evidence. A diagnosis is not evidence. It's not a fact. It's an interpretation of the facts. It's evidence of the fact that a doctor thought Nietzsche had syphilis at a time when he's trying to diagnose somebody in 1889 and a huge proportion of European men have contracted syphilis. So he says, does this makes, I guess he has syphilis, another syphilitic, right? But all the available evidence seems to say no, that doesn't actually make sense. So, the brothel thing too, I think that's people reasoning backward. They have heard that Nietzsche had syphilis, and so they say, oh, and he didn't, but how could he have had syphilis? Because he wasn't fucking Casanova. He must have been going to brothels. But it is interesting, I guess we don't really know whether Nietzsche was a brothel enjoyer, but his friend Paul Deussen wrote a book about Nietzsche. That was one of his friends from Schulpforta. He met him at Schulpforta, and then they were friends for many years. And he said when Nietzsche was younger that one time Nietzsche came into town and he asked the carriage driver to take him to a hotel, and he accidentally took him to a brothel. This became kind of a famous story that Nietzsche walked in and was so like horrified and like awkward and didn't know what to do seeing all these scantily clad women. Went over and played a single note on the piano, and he said it was almost as if the spell was broken and Nietzsche departed. Now, people could read all sorts of things into that story. Kaufman actually, in his biography, suggests that Thomas Mann basically took this incident and he reasoned, oh, Nietzsche must have been deep down enticed by the brothel, and then later he must have come back and infected himself. But again, that's kind of reasoning backwards from he had syphilis, right? It's entirely possible Nietzsche just died a virgin, guys. Like, it is possible. It's also possible he had a bunch of relationships that we don't even know about. Like, that's the other thing too, is like we're trying to like reconstruct somebody's life from what? Like letters, right? We have far more documentation on our lives today than they did back then. Like, we're actually taking pictures and videos in real time or telling our friends in real time. And like, that kind of scares me too. I'm like, if I were to become a notable figure, are people going to like read my text messages in the future? And that's horrifying to think about. But all that is set aside, we have way more documentation and evidence of like all of our lives now. And yet, in your own life, that there are secrets that you have that you've never documented, in all likelihood. And maybe if you were a notable historical figure, a historian would find out about it and tell everyone. Maybe not. Maybe they would never know. Maybe there are successfully kept secrets about people's lives. And especially during that time in Wilhelmine, Germany, it was just simply not appropriate to be like there were no like openly loose women other than prostitutes. I mean, there were to some extent, but that was not looked at as a normal thing in high society. Wilhelmine Germany is very much analogous to Victorian England in many ways. And, the brothels existed and men kind of had that option. But like, as far as like the kind of women that Nietzsche was often pursuing, you know, I don't think it would necessarily, it's like the fossil record, right? With biology. It's a wonder we have any of them, right? Granted, people wrote a lot more down in letters back then, but if we were to have a letter confirming Nietzsche had a relationship with some woman, that would be like amazing, but we don't. But we just don't know, I think it's in all likelihood he probably was largely unsuccessful with women. But we just don't know. People need to be a little bit more like intellectually humble about the details of people's lives. Again, it's like a memeing thing. It's like there's a image or an aura or vibe around Nietzsche. It's like, oh, he was the angry incel who struck out with women and went to brothels and got syphilis. It's like a whole legend people have created in their head, and that's why they believe this. We should be a little bit more humble to say we don't actually know. And again, contrary to popular belief, Lou Salome was not the only woman in Nietzsche's life. She is largely the one responsible for telling us how obsessed he was with her. By the way, like 30 years after the fact, after he was dead and couldn't defend himself, she makes all these claims. And meanwhile, Nietzsche had friendships with many, many women. I remember one time when I was really looking into this, I was like, who were all of Nietzsche's, not girlfriends, but friends who are girls? And I found countless examples of women who had wonderful relationships with Nietzsche, friend relationships. And he gravitated towards women who were actually very philosophically inclined and creative and unconventional in their beliefs. And he also seemed to have a thing for older women. And there's also the kind of allegations about him being in love with Cosima. But point being, I remember there was one anecdote where I think it was Meta von Salis came into the little restaurant or at the inn in Sils Maria, where Nietzsche was staying. And Nietzsche was already there talking to two other women. One was Helen Zimmer and one was another one. Like, it seemed like he was friends with a lot of women, and not just women he was like romantically interested in. Like Malvida von Meisenberg was an older woman who had like, I know I just said Nietzsche was into older women, but she was like, I think practically elderly when Nietzsche met her. I don't think he had any romantic like prospects on her. And they had a perfectly cordial relationship. He when he describes reading her book, and he like in a letter heaps praise on her for like her philosophical insights and how they've sort of lingered with him all day, and on his walk how he's still thinking about the things that she wrote about. And so there's just so many like oversimplifications of like, oh, Nietzsche struck out with women so he hated them. For one, it's not clear to me that he hated them, and it's not clear to me that he always struck out. He had so many friendships with so many women, including many feminists and socialists who were very unconventional. It's entirely possible he had a tryst with one of them or something like that. We just don't know. Or maybe he didn't. We just don't know. But it's like it's way more interesting to me to like admit we don't know and that there's all these possibilities than to just be like oh, incel or whatever. Like that's a fun meme. Like I get it. If you're making a philosophy meme, sure, make Nietzsche the part of the incel. But if you're actually trying to like understand what his life was like, whenever you dig into the stuff more deeply, you find it's more complicated. And yeah. Somebody says, are you familiar with someone like C.S. Lewis, and how do you compare his thoughts with Nietzsche? I don't know anyone like C.S. Lewis. I think he was one of a kind. No, in all seriousness, yeah, I've read the Screw Tape Letters. When I was a kid, I was really into The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. I think that was just because I was into Tolkien, and my parents were like, well, then you should read this. In retrospect, the Christian allegory is so obvious. When I was a kid, it all went right over my head. But and I don't think I finished Narnia. C.S. Lewis has some interesting ideas. I think he's actually a very effective apologist, insofar as like he reconciles some of the fundamental, I don't want to say contradictions, but maybe like uncomfortable or like he's got like a famous passage where he talks about like the doors from hell are locked from the inside. I believe that's him, C.S. Lewis. That like sort of reconciling something Nietzsche talks about that developed, like the pity that people experience for the soul eternally damned to hell. Like Christianity creates a new, almost unbearable form of pity, right? Because if you really pity mankind and the plight and the suffering of man, oh, just the feeling of all those sinners suffering forever in hell, what an unbearable thought, right? Well, C.S. Lewis comes along, there's different ways of reconciling it. The Calvinists say they weren't part of the elect. Yeah, God does hate people. It's not universal love. There are some people, in Romans, God says from the moment they were in the womb, Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated. So they can cherry pick those passages. C.S. Lewis, I like his approach better of saying like, oh, well, everyone who's in hell, they could, like, if they really wanted to, they could turn away from their sins even then. like love God, but that's such a uh, repentance is such a hard thing that there are people who will choose death, spiritual death over repentance. So that's a pretty good apologetic. He's also what is it, Mere Christianity, where he gives us the Lord, liar, lunatic trichotomy. He's an effective apologist, is how I would look at it. Ultimately, if you look at C.S. Lewis's Christianity, though, I mean, I believe he says he converted to theism. He was like logically convinced of the truth of theism. And then he set out on like a trip. They were like riding bikes or riding motorcycles, just a random trip. And he said, he had a spiritual epiphany. He's like, I believe I converted to theism, but I didn't yet believe in Christianity. We took this bike ride from, however many miles. And when I got on the bike, I didn't believe Jesus was the Son of God. And when I got off, I did. And I can't explain logically why. He described it or described it as similar to the sun coming out after the clouds parting, like the clouds of ignorance and uncertainty, and suddenly the truth was laid bare before him, right? That, to me, a lot of people, when they say, well, I had a religious experience, I'm like, okay, I understand that. If I had that experience, maybe I was having certainty of the divinity of Christ beamed into my head by God, then hot damn, I guess I'll be a Christian. I've personally never had that. And it's kind of like most apologetics, I find the arguments he puts forward, I understand why they're persuasive. Like rhetorically, I really enjoy them, but I am not as affected by rhetoric as most people are. I'm immune to propaganda. Let's go to another patron question. We're kind of just like bouncing back and forth. Have you ever done Joseph Campbell? His work is what initiated me into this whole universe. I have not talked about Joseph Campbell. I recently read that there has been a lot more critical scholarship about Joseph Campbell, that he even like misrepresented quotations and misrepresented myths and legends from other cultures to kind of like fit it into his mold of the hero with a thousand faces. That there's been a lot of sort of people turning against the hero with a thousand faces in recent years. That being said, I'd actually like to cover, he's got two books called they're like Oriental and Occidental Religion or Gods or something like that. I'm trying to remember the name of the volumes. It's like just sort of like a study of like all the different like totem and taboo and deities of like local tribal and shamanic customs, sort of like the development of like all the gods, faces of God. I think there's like, yeah, I think that's it, something like that, faces of God. Okay. Somebody asks, hey Keegan, I have never heard you talk about the honey sacrifice. I think it's one of my favorite parts of Zarathustra. Do you call this part, and what do you take it to symbolize? I do, and I I have not talked about the honey sacrifice. I don't know about that. I thought I did sometime in season 2. Um, I'll think about that. Maybe that can be, maybe that could be the topic of a future episode if I haven't really delved into it deeply. But I'll tell you, I'm just gonna be honest with you. I'm not up for doing an off the cuff exegesis of a passage from Zarathustra right now, because that's the hardest Nietzsche work to exegesize. And if I was going to do that, I would need to go in like, in order to really be responsible about it, you got to take it line by line and in context. So somebody says, how do you see the will to power and Nietzsche's ideas about thunderstrikes? Oh, I know what you mean. Okay. Extrapolating it to the stars and outside Earth humans fighting themselves. He never thought about bigger universe. Oh, you mean like, do Vulcans and Romulans and Klingons have the will to power? Yeah, they do. The Goa'uld definitely have a will to power. That's like I know I'm not answering your question, but like Stargate is definitely I like Stargate because it portrays, like, we're always portraying, I'm trying to think of how to put it like this. We there's so much in sci-fi where like an alien species is used to like reflect something about humanity. Like they're always trying to portray like some aspect of the human species. But to the extent whenever they do it in a villainous way, or like the way Star Trek does it, like what the Klingons in the original series are the USSR, or they're like China. Um, both of the Klingons and the Romulans are basically the USSR in the original Star Trek because it was the 60s, right? So they're like a monoculture that's like top-down authoritarian. The first Klingon appearance, they're not like a warrior culture. They're like talking about, like he's like reading off a list of crimes against the state, and they have like a mind scanner that like surveillance, and it's like it's very Soviet, right? What I like about the Goa'uld and Stargate is that they reflect like a really Nietzschean description of like human nature insofar as, or like a very like Michelsian, Robert Michels, Iron Law of Oligarchy, right? That they're like an aristocratic oligarchic society where you have these like warring system lords. It's not just like this monoculture. It's like all of the warlords like hate each other, but they also like, or like they don't hate each other necessarily, but they're like, they'll work together the way the Greek city states will work together to like fight Persia, but they're not technically friends. And that's like the real structures of power in the world typically emulate that. You typically have this like, I've put it, how do I put it? Oligarchy is like a entropic force almost on the political system, that you might have the potential for different forms of government, but it's always sort of like sliding towards oligarchy for a variety of reasons. And so that to me is like sort of like the eternal, every attempt at a social system that's non-oligarchic, it's not impossible, but you're fighting against the entropy of oligarchy. You have to be like constantly on guard against it. Here in America, we're always on guard against like monarchy, against the tyrant, right? Because we were founded by an oligarchy, and that's who the oligarchy is afraid of, right? The oligarchies aren't afraid of the people, they're afraid of tyrants. They're afraid of one of their number rising up to end the oligarchy and create autocratic rule. So we got that whole message in America. The tree of liberty has to be watered by the blood of tyrants. It would, in reality, true liberty, if you really wanted to have like a society that was truly free for everyone, it would need to be watered with the blood of oligarchs. But anyway, I don't know if that answers your question. I guess you asked me about aliens and extrapolating it to the stars and outside Earth, people fighting. So, I guess that gives me license to talk about whatever I want. So I'll consider your question answered. Let's go to another patron question. Um, okay. Considering Nietzsche's admiration for the Greeks' ability to stop courageously at the surface and believe in forms, tones, and words, how how do you think Peter Kingsley's translations of Parmenides' fragments and their emphasis on the mystical and the unity of being challenge or complement Nietzsche's views on Greek culture and philosophy? So I haven't read these, but the short answer is that you should look into Nietzsche's essay "Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks" and his pre-Platonic lectures. He makes his view on Parmenides very clear. Like, you have to separate everything Nietzsche says about the Greeks from what he thinks about Greek philosophers. The philosopher is a strange, crazy, extraordinary type of person in ancient Greece. He devotes like the whole beginning of both his lectures and Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks to posing the question of how the philosopher, the type of the philosopher, could ever arise in ancient Greek culture at all. He basically says this is a mystery because they considered impractical knowledge that wasn't embodied, to be useless. That was what they called the philosopher's knowledge. So Parmenides is already kind of like a type of individual who in ancient Greece is anti-Greek in some ways. I mean, Nietzsche says in Philosophy of the Tragic Age of the Greeks about Parmenides, like it's like hard to believe that the Greek world could throw up a type like Parmenides at all. Um, and the way he describes Parmenides, the words he uses, he calls him bloodless. He says he dives into the cold bath of his icy abstractions. He says that what is it? He says that he makes being into a dead static, unmovable ball, which is true, by the way. That was his conception of reality. It never moves, it never changes. It's just this enduring form, which he said was ultimately spherical, right? I don't know how it could be spherical if it's the totality of everything, but apparently the totality of everything has a shape to Parmenides. But bloodless is the main thing, right? Um, he basically says that Parmenides he says it wasn't a religious uh, epiphany. He had an epiphany strictly out of the dictates of logic, that this great insight into the theory of pure being. And that he, at that moment, basically completely, the meaning of calling him bloodless is that he like detaches from the phenomenal world entirely and says it's all a deception, it's all a lie. None of this is true being. Um, Now Parmenides, I mean, like I understand Nietzsche's critique wholeheartedly. I personally don't think he was as anti-Greek as Nietzsche thinks he was. I think the Greeks are a very religious people who do believe there's a hidden reality behind things. There is a metaphysical significance to their mysteries. I don't think they were as worldly as Nietzsche says they were, but I don't. How would I put this? I think he's correct that Parmenides takes this to an excessive level, where he basically says that the entirety of the world in which anything happens or like any of the things we care about that's not real and it doesn't matter. I don't know, or how would I put it? Like it's very hard to become absorbed in one of these like political struggles for power between the Greek city states, which the Greeks are the political men par excellence, as Nietzsche says, and that all of these city states would have loved to destroy each other out of hatred and jealousy. It's very hard to get absorbed in that when you're like, well, all of this phenomenal world that's going on, all of the city states, all the whole natural world, your very being, all of this is all sort of just like a deception or an illusion. You've made some sort of logical failure because clearly movement and change is impossible. Um, I get Nietzsche's point that it's a excessive philosophizing that it does almost become antithetical to the Greek spirit. Okay, let's go back to live chat questions. Why did you choose Nietzsche, by the way? He chose me. Yeah, I found Nietzsche or he found me, however you want to see it. I mean, in all honesty, I know Nietzsche really well and he's very popular and there's a lot of deception, or not deception, in some cases deception, but misconception about Nietzsche. Uh, in the online world, in the world of people trying to explain this stuff. I mean, I did a video on the School of Life intro to Nietzsche, and I think I talked about it for like 45 minutes, even though it's a 5-minute video, because almost every single thing they say is, if not wrong, like misleading in some way or emphasizing the wrong thing. Or like they put forward these ideas like that he hugged the horse when he died, which is not true. Right? It's like, again, like with syphilis, I try to be careful and say that I don't know to an absolute certainty, but to the degree that I can feel confident saying anything about the details of Nietzsche's life, just as it's almost impossible that he had syphilis, it's very unlikely that he actually hugged a horse as he was having his collapse. And so you see stuff like that and these like really popular, that video had like 4 million views or whatever. People just kind of casually say it. They throw it out there because it's an interesting fact that they can put in that's part of this legend. But so that's a lot of why, is that it's not uncommon to hear like 2 or 3 myths about Nietzsche in most introductions to his philosophy. And he's one of the most interesting and important philosophers out there. So there's a real hunger for this, but people are getting fed slop. So that's why I'm here. Nicholas Whitehouse. I have a question about what meant Nietzsche by historical sense, what he meant by it, and why he considers it as an ignoble taste, and if this taste is the same in the contemporary world. There's a very interesting passage in The Gay Science where he's talking about translations and how you can tell the degree of a culture's historical sense by the way that they make their translations. And so the comparison he makes is to like the ancient Romans. So the ancient Romans, when they take over ancient Greece, Macedonia at that point, Macedonian Empire. And they become the custodians of the Greek culture. The way Nietzsche puts it is that, like, so if you're translating, they start translating all these Greek texts into Latin, epic poems and tragedies and so on and so forth. And there are sort of two ways that you could do this, right? You could, like, because if I translate a poem, there might be a metaphor or a double entendre or an allusion that might be very obvious to somebody who's Greek living at the time. I reference, I'll do something that, like I reference the Pythian oracle, right? That wouldn't have been like that obscure to a Roman, but if you just go around today talking about Pythian oracles, people will be like, "What are you talking about?" Right? But a Greek immediately like, "Oh, I know you're talking about the the Pythia, the oracle at Delphi, right? The oracle blessed by Apollo with a divine madness that allows them to speak the truth of what's going to happen in the future." So there's all these sort of like allusions and like just the lexicon of your cultural capital, right? And Nietzsche says when the Romans began to translate all of their Greek epics and the Greek cultural capital into Latin, they have no compunction about changing all of those things to be more relevant to the Roman life. And let me give you an example from modern society, right? It's like the story of Coppola's new film, Megalopolis, is about Catalina from ancient Rome. But the story's not set in ancient Rome; it's set in New Rome. And what Coppola said is he's like, I had the idea of doing the Cataline story set in modern day New York City, and that's sort of what it's supposed to replicate, right? So, and other people have done this. I mean, like Baz Luhrmann does it with Romeo and Juliet, right? So it's just like a little thing. It's not like modern people don't understand that in the past people used to carry swords for a duel, right? Or by so this is an interesting thing. Baz Luhrmann and his Romeo and Juliet, uh, what is the word? Adaptation. He actually includes, even though it's in modern day and they have guns instead of swords, it's still biting their thumb. Do you bite your thumb at us, sir? Whereas, what would an actual allegory to the modern day be? It'd be the middle finger, something like that. There's different things in other cultures, right? But in contemporary American society, it would be the middle finger. It wouldn't be thumb biting. Be like, did you give me the finger? Would be the actual interaction. And so that's sort of what I mean by like taking a reference or like something from the previous culture that doesn't really translate and just changing it so it's in the modern day. And Nietzsche basically says the Romans showed they had no historical sense because everything was made into something that was Roman. They would translate things from the Greek world from all over. And he said, but this was just their attitude that this is all in the custody of the Imperium Romanum, right? A lot of empires think like this. The English often did this, and that's translated into the English speaking world. That the English speaking culture that's now sort of the vanguard is America and Hollywood, but we're very syncretic in that way and very willing to just sort of like take things from all over and be like, I want to do a modern day retelling. I want to do an American retelling. And that lacks the historical sense, but we would expect that because these empires basically look at all of these cultures as something that they own, like these multicultural cosmopolitan empires look at it like we're in charge, we're managing, all of these different cultures, and we're going to kind of like blend them together into one Roman Empire. It's all of these cultures exist for us, right? So, how would I put it? Uh, he says that betrays a lack of historical sense. He says that the modern comparison or modern to Nietzsche's time would be like the way the French do things versus the Germans. So like he says the French basically incorporated all of the Roman culture and all of classical antiquity in the same way that the Romans incorporated everything under their empire. But the Germans, and this is actually very funny to consider in light of the fact that elsewhere Nietzsche says the Germans have no historical sense. But he said, the Germans, the way that they would translate, like they would translate a Greek epic poem into German and they would put it in dactylic hexameters. So like if you don't know what a hexameter is, that's like the meter of Greek poetry. So, what's a way to explain this? So, like an iamb in iambic pentameter, it's like a 2-syllable beat. And so the meter of iambic pentameter, like from Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, is like a gentle knight was pricking on the plain. Da dot da dot da dot da dot da dot. 10 beats. If you go to 12, you get a hexameter, so 6 iambs. It feels really unnatural and weird. And actually, Edmund Spenser did that in The Fairy Queen. It's like a 9-line stanza, and the first 8 are hexameter or are pentameter, Shakespearean iambic pentameter, right? That we're all familiar with. The last line of every stanza is in hexameter, and that in and of itself, that is a feat to be able to do that. Because again, in English, it sounds very unnatural, and I would imagine as English comes from Proto-Germanic languages, it's probably pretty unnatural in German as well. But that's the German commitment to like trying to actually translate the Greek into the German. Like, we're going to continue the meter. We're going to include all of the illusions exactly as they are. We're going to make it our business to understand all of those illusions in cultural capital. To truly, it's like so the difference in translation, revealing the different levels of historical sense, basically is like, are you trying to translate this and maintain its alien character to your culture and the way you see the world? Or are you trying to translate it into something that is like you, that you already understand, right? And so the cultures that tend to lack a historical sense just sort of, they assume what it really is, the lacking of a historical sense. And this is, you see this in the Anglo world all the time. It's assuming everyone's just like you, right? The differences between us are just these like sort of aesthetic trappings. And ultimately, at the end of the day, everyone just wants the same things. They just want a better life for their family, and they want, um, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs applies to everybody, blah, blah, blah. The way of translating with a historical sense is the recognition everyone's not like me. They actually saw the world a different way. They would actually look at the way we view the world as crazy, right? They would have all sorts of problems and contradict us in all sorts of ways. So that to me, I think, is a good way of explaining the historical sense. And he says specifically, it's most lacking in philosophers, that they have a congenital defect that they're lacking in the historical sense. They tend to believe like everyone fundamentally is, if not just like me, we're all bound by the same universal truths. It's the same universalism, like universalism, dogmatism, as Nietzsche talks about it in Beyond Good and Evil. That is a expression of the lack of historical sense. So yeah, that's what I would say. Okay. Brian Utility asked a question. Somebody says Nietzsche told, it wasn't a question. He said Nietzsche told a doctor he had gonorrhea because Wagner assumed his blindness was from masturbation. I don't believe he told the doctor he had gonorrhea. I believe that the doctor assumed that it was diarrhea or gonorrhea, not diarrhea. But it's been a while since I've looked into that whole incident. Basically, Nietzsche was seeing the doctor because of his blindness. So yet again, the real culprit, now that we know historically, was likely a tumor or it was a congenital defect. But his headaches, his migraines, his increasing blindness that happened throughout his life, that seemed to be like a pre-existing problem. And Wagner, within his circle, he knew doctors, and he said, "Oh, I want to help you out, Nietzsche. You're suffering from this condition that no doctor can help you with. Maybe I can give you like a recommendation." So he sees this doctor, and the doctor assumes that Nietzsche has like an STD, as you put it, or I think he said that Nietzsche's problem was probably masturbating too much. But it's very sad to me when we consider that he probably had like a real condition. So, looks like the timer on the stream is stopped. Can everyone still see the stream? I hope I'm not having a connection issue. Chat are you still with me? Is anyone in chat? Let's see here. There's only one way to find out, and it's to pull up the stream on my phone because nobody in chat is saying anything. So I'm assuming. Oh no, I can see myself. Okay. Maybe the chat has just stopped, or maybe I'm like having. That's weird. Yeah, okay. On my phone, I can see everyone say yes, they're still with me. But the live chat's not updating on my desktop, so. And it's not like showing that it's continuing the stream. That's very odd. Ned Braden says, what's the acronym CADASIL? That is CADASIL. Okay. So I guess since the live chat's not updating here, I'll answer a couple more patron questions. Let's see here. I think it would be nice if you discuss Nietzsche in relation to contemporary issues, such as contemporary music, politics, or whatever. How would Nietzsche feel about the Beatles, say, or Trump, Israel, Palestine, things like that? I realize it would all be hypothetical, but it would be interesting to hear how you relate Nietzsche to the major issues that are floating around the world today. I know the guy who asked this too. I actually really like him. He's provided some like really good critiques, or like helped me. He's criticized me in very helpful ways in the past. So I want to answer his question. But oh man. Like those, like you listed like 3 topics that I have almost no interest in talking about. Because it's like, I guess I'll make a meta comment on the Israel-Palestine thing. So that's yet another thing that I have no control over. And it's yet another thing that like people referencing it before, there's like a whole like tribalistic element to that. Not even having to do with like the literal tribes who are fighting. I mean, like in America, like what sort of subculture you identify with is going to affect like how you think about these issues. And all of it has very little to do with like the reality of the conflict. Now, like, okay, I do understand like there are the people who are like, we're going to withhold our vote, like the Muslim Americans in Michigan are like, we're going to withhold our vote from the Democrats to punish them, to discipline them for not, you thought we were supposed to be part of your like rainbow coalition of people, and apparently we're not. So we're going to withhold our vote to try and screw you over. You could say that's maybe like a practical way of like trying to stand up for your side or something like that. And then obviously on the Israel side, there's all sorts of, I mean, it seems like everyone in power is already on that side. So you don't really need to do much. But, like, so for me personally, I'm like, what do I stand to gain by wading into this discussion? Everyone's made up their mind. There's very little I can do about it, practically speaking. I'm only going to alienate like one side or the other of my audience. And people are then, depending on how I answer and what I think, people are going to like impute all sorts of motives onto me, and they're going to like caricature me, and they're going to basically like make bad faith arguments and assume I believe a bunch of other things that I don't based on one position. It's also tiresome, and I'm not really interested in being a part of it. Because it's like I've said it before, I want this channel to be like a little like I am like Julian Morrow in that way from The Secret History. Like, are you ready to leave the phenomenal world behind and enter into the sublime? That's what we're doing here. And I know I'm talking. We've been getting down in the mud with the pigs this whole live stream. That's kind of what these are for. That's probably fair. That's why people are asking me about it on the live stream, because that's when I kind of talk about this kind of thing. But like, the reason why I always hesitate when I get to like these wedge issues is because like the reason why people hold the loyalties they do, and the positions they have, has very little to do with like logic or like well, it's not based on an argument or evidence, right? It's not something that I can change people's minds on. Um, but I will say this, as far as like, if I was in the shoes of either of those parties, I understand why they do what they do, right? I get tired of the whinging moralism that's in all of our media about like, do you condemn the evil of what's happened? And I'm like, Okay, well, if you think about what they're doing and what their position is, and then I put myself into their position, it's not about being like, people often want to put themselves into the position of another person to like empathize with them, and then therefore say, well, therefore I should hold this position based on the fact that their position is understandable or it is um, justifiable, right? If I was in their shoes, I'd be doing the same thing. Therefore, I must support them, right? That's not what I'm saying at all, because I'm not in their shoes, so I don't have to do anything. Um, what I'm saying is, I very rarely, like, let's take it away from Israel Palestine, right? Like if we're just going to talk about like just a resistance fighter in a random country, right? uh, who is opposing a regime that he doesn't agree with for religious reasons. And then they use terrorism and they kill civilians. And we're all supposed to like be like super upset about it, but then you like look at the other options that they actually had and you're like, well, that's kind of what it is, right? Like um when your back is against the wall and you're in an existential struggle for your existence, you're going to do things that other people are going to judge is morally not okay. Um, but what does that mean? Unless it's backed by force, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. Like my moral condemnation is worth nothing. It's worth nothing. And so, you know, that's the thing that kind of bothers me is like there's very little like real politique in current political commentary anymore. Um, and I guess that's just because then it just becomes like you're calling a horse race. Like it becomes like election commentary or something. Or you just, and there's a million people doing that with like say the Ukraine war, where like all they do is talk about strategy all day. There's like whole channels now that are like making a real buck off the fact of like, look at this battle map of the Ukraine war. Looks like the Russians are doing this, and looks like the Ukrainians are doing that, and blah blah blah. And they're all very excited about it, and I wish them all the best. But when it comes to like analyzing the reasons behind what people do, like guys, it's power. If you want to know what Nietzsche would think about it, it's power, right? So think about what their objectives are, and then think about how they're attempting to achieve those objectives. Israel's objective is we don't want any Palestinians on our land. We're going to ethnically cleanse them and get rid of them. And if that's your objective, what they're doing makes sense. Basically, the hardliners on the other side, it's the same thing. I'm sure there are many civilians on both sides who would be happy to live with people of the other persuasion or culture, but that's just not the reality. And they would need to be the ones to sort that out, right? But the holding hands and singing kumbaya option rarely is a reality, and usually in a blood feud like this, it's personal at this point. You don't forgive if your child got their head blown off. You don't forgive that. You have the I don't know. It's like asking me to comment on like a blood feud between like two warring tribes in a part of the world that I have no stake in. And they have the way you should analyze it is ask yourself what benefits them, what objectives are they pursuing, how are they pursuing them? That's how you understand the conflict. It's not a morality. This is not a clash of civilizations. This isn't Western values versus Eastern values. This is a struggle for power and land. It's the oldest story in the book, right? And it that's how I see that whole conflict. Trump is again, I don't really evaluate him from a Nietzschean lens so much. I evaluate that from the lens of, again, like Machiavellian politics. That to me is the more interesting thing yet again. So a lot of the time what I have to say is usually not very interesting unless you ask me some sort of specific question, right? Because I think in description, I don't think in terms of prescription so much. So that's as far as I'll go as to answering that question. So I love the guy. That's from Gutso Pink. He's a patron. That's as far as I'll go into it. I'll give you kind of just my meta comments which again may be disappointing to a lot of people, but it's just like it's something that I can't that my words won't change, and that like fundamentally it doesn't change the reality of the situation, the what people will do to pursue the goals that they have. Okay, let's go. This is just confirmation. Of course, the Nietzsche fan is also a Hitler fan. That's why he's maneuvering around instead of condemning Hamas. Yeah, sure. I love that the like association that they're making with Hamas and like Nazis, with just like a completely different ideology that has nothing to do with one another. Yeah. Okay, we got another super chat. You like A Song of Ice and Fire? Uh, no. Sorry. I read the first book, like right before my wife is really into Song of Ice and Fire, and before the show came out, she was like, "You should read this." So I read the first book and watched the first season of Game of Thrones, and I thought it was cool. And then I never watched anything else, and I'm really glad I never really got into it because it seems like the whole thing's been like a long con job, kind of similar to how what J.J. Abrams did to everybody in Lost, at least as far as the show goes. But I mean, honestly, kind of with the books too, right? I mean, um, it seems like they just like George R. R. Martin has probably no plans to ever finish that series, and I think he's gotten bored with it. I don't know why he originally planned it as a trilogy, and then eventually it became a 7-part thing gradually over time. And he's realized at a certain point that he doesn't have it in him to finish. I don't know, but I think he's clearly stalling. And then the show just kind of made it up as they went along, and they didn't know where they were going with it, and it disappointed everybody. So I wasn't really into it. Some of the concepts in it are cool. I like the idea that, you know, I like the idea that when you're sort of like setting up the story about the fall of the old social order, that like the harbinger of that are the Dothraki, which are like a steppe tribe sort of people, like the Xiongnu or the Mongols or something. That's an interesting bit of historical sort of like parallel to draw on, which a lot of fantasy authors do, pull things from real world history. I wish that was more of the story though, because it's like a thing that's teased for a long time, but like they're on the other side of the ocean and everything. So it's like this long buildup and we never really get there. That's kind of how I feel about Game of Thrones, about Song of Ice and Fire. I also think that his predilection for killing his characters and just like wanting to like snuff out hope and the heroic and all of these things. Um, there is a time and a place for that, and the first book is kind of brilliant in that way, and that he gives us that reversal. I just wish there was more of a point to it. I think if he had like sat down, I don't like these long rambling series, right? I think you should know where your story is going to end before you write it, and you should have a clear plan for the time frame. And he should have just sat down and wrote a trilogy and had like a clear beginning, middle, and end. And if you're going to do that thing where you kind of undermine all the heroic and hopeful tropes of fantasy, then okay, it's one thing to undermine and subvert something, but that's not really a meaning. That's like a negative meaning, right? It's like subversion, it's a critique, but it's not really giving you anything. So what is the point of that, right? Like like the movie Taxi Driver. There's no that's like I that comes to mind because that was like the epitome of like anti-hero style cinema. So, the 70s, they kind of turn away from like the Shane type of hero who rides off into the sunset, and it's all these anti-heroes who kind of are flawed and are scumbags or might not even have good motives, right? So, the character study is about a main character who's kind of Travis Bickle's kind of unlikable, and his life is just kind of this spiral of insanity. And but in the end, like I do feel like there's a point to Taxi Driver, right? If nothing else, there's an interesting thing in there insofar as like he might have just tried to shoot the senator, like Palantine, but he fails, and then he goes and shoots some gangsters, and he's celebrated as like a hero. And so when really he didn't do it out of heroic motive, he did it because he was a fucking psycho who wanted to kill a bunch of people to like, I don't know what, like break out of this monotony and the insanity of his daily life, the daily grind. So I feel like there's still a point there. A lot of people also think the end of Taxi Driver is like a dream or it doesn't really happen. That's certainly something we could debate about. But so I guess that's my critique of A Song of Ice and Fire, is that, like, if that's because he, famously George R. R. Martin dislikes Tolkien. He hates Tolkien for all of the reasons we've kind of been talking about. Like, Tolkien falsifies reality with his art, right? He makes the heroic, he makes the hopeful, like, triumph in the end in a kind of unrealistic manner, I guess, from the George R. R. Martin perspective. It's very high fantasy, and so George R. R. Martin's writing this kind of, like, not necessarily low fantasy, but it's gritty and Machiavellian, as we've said, and it subverts all of those things. I just don't. It's not clear to me, because the series hasn't ended, and it's unclear that it ever will, and the direction of the show just got taken in another direction by other people. It's not clear to me what the point is. Like, what is the point of undermining these things? What is he leaving? What is he trying to say exactly? And I don't know. I'll leave it there. I will say, but again, as I brought up, like, it's a shame because the first book is really good because it does subvert, like, because Ned Stark, I won't give a spoiler, but I'll just say he won't be heading for the second book if you haven't read the first one. But I feel like that needs to be paid off with something at the end. It doesn't have to be a heroic or hopeful ending, but there has to be some reason why everything happened. Like, I don't know. Okay, another super chat. If Nietzsche was the lead singer of a metal band, which one would it be? Have you ever listened to Nietzsche's piano compositions? It's very, like, sort of meandering, and there are some parts written for vocalists. It's very operatic, and I'm trying to think of who Nietzsche would sing like. I feel like he would be into very triumphant sounding music. He would like major key compositions. Wagner did some minor key stuff though as well. I'm trying to think of, like, who, because Nietzsche still loved Wagner's music, even though he didn't like the artistic content or the message behind it or the movement that Wagner was a part of. Um, yeah, like, who is sort of like that today? Like, what's the term for, like, the total work of art? Um, I don't know. I see, like, what's coming to mind is all these, like, symphonic metal bands, like Blind Guardian and Iced Earth and stuff like that. But I almost feel like the cheesiness and the bombasticity, and there are a lot of things that I think Nietzsche would think would be, like, really poor taste about a lot of those bands as well. So I feel like it'd have to be a band that takes themselves, like, a little more seriously, um, or, like, maybe Sabaton. Even that's a little silly. Um, so I don't know, and I don't think Nietzsche has the singing chops to sing in any of those bands. So I don't really know. But as far as, like, the musical content, yeah, maybe he would like Sabaton. Maybe, I don't know. Uh, okay, let's see here. David Lynch said Eraserhead was his most spiritual film. What do you think he means by that? Well, famously, when he was asked this, to elaborate on this, David Lynch said no. So I will give a similar answer. I mean, it's his most spiritual film because it's a character study about, like, that is the soul of all of David Lynch's work. You can kind of understand a lot of what David Lynch, like, the allegorical story of Eraserhead, which is kind of very horrifying, is sort of repeated in many of his other works. So, you know, uh, somebody said Nietzsche ended up preferring Bizet. Yeah, Bizet. That's yes. He is a very melodic and tame composer, but I agree with that. The Doors, maybe not metal though. Uh, hmm, the Doors. It's an interesting choice. I think Nietzsche would, if we want to get into classic rock, I think Nietzsche would actually appreciate a lot of early Queen, uh, and that is definitely the Gesamtkunstwerk. Yeah, I think I mispronounced that, but yeah. So let's see. Did I miss any patron questions? I guess I don't have to get to every last one of them. Um, I've pretty much talked about all of these that I can really cover within a couple of minutes. So yeah, I'll answer a couple more questions from the comments from the live chat, and then we'll probably call it here. Um, let's see here. Huh. What would Nietzsche think of Taoism? I love mixing it with Nietzschean ideas, but I'm curious if you think he might consider it slave morality with the Wu Wei non-action, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so a lot of people have actually drawn a comparison between Nietzsche and Taoism, and it's probably has more to do with the fact, like the epistemology of Nietzsche, so to speak. Like the non-duality of Nietzsche's thought is very Taoist. In pointing out the ways in which, um, you know, what is that passage from Lao Tzu? It's like basically like, okay, like, you think you're using a bowl to hold something, but it's the empty space in the bowl that's doing the work. And like, it's like you live in a house, but it's the empty space within the house that you dwell in. We that basically like we use nothingness. We use the void. We use non-entity that actually has a use for us. Uh, the Tao Te Ching is always reminding us of the way in which, as you say, um, that which is apparently nothing or non-existent or in the background or insignificant, or that which is soft can wear down the hard. That's one of the central metaphors, right? Water, that which is soft can wear down the hard. It says that that's one of the reasons why people can't understand the Tao, because the Tao is like water. It always seeks the lowest level and dwells in places that human beings find abominable, right? So water quite literally seeks the lowest level by gravity, and then it sort of like it flows down from the high mountains into the muddy, mucky marshlands and into the sewers and so on and so forth. So whereas human beings don't seek the lowest level, the human beings are more, we're fiery creatures. We're young creatures. We want to leap up. We want to advance ourselves. We want to climb hierarchies. We want to do all these things. But Taoism. So would Nietzsche consider that slave morality? I mean, maybe to some extent, there could be some interpretations of Taoism he might see that way, but I don't think that would be like a mature reading of what's going on in Taoism, because like even like the legalists like Han Feizi are influenced by Taoism. Like the legalists are like the Machiavellians of China, and they basically disagreed with the Confucians and the Mencians that human beings are inherently good and that you should be ruling according to virtue, right? De would be like the main central concept of the Confucians. It's the virtue of the leader that keeps the social order. The legalists in the Hanfei come around and say, no, it's actually reward and punishment. That's what keeps people, that's what holds the empire together. It's the application of force. But the interesting thing, and the connection to Taoism that people see there, is that Hanfei says that um, the skilled leader is the one who doesn't have to micromanage and have his attention on all these like the affairs of state, right? He shouldn't even have to actively reward and punish. He should establish that he has the power to reward and punish. But if you've established that, then you should never have to like you shouldn't have to be spending your time rewarding and punishing, because that's actually the sign of a bad leader. If people are constantly doubting your power and then you're having to punish them, uh, that makes it so your state doesn't function as efficiently. And so, in the same way that the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi describe nature as all sort of working with these sort of like invisible harmonies and rhythms, that it happens by itself. I believe it's Zhiran. Um, I believe that's the correct word, is spontaneity. Everything sort of happens spontaneously because the background, like all of the action is going on in the background. It's happening automatically, right? So the Han Fei presents this idea of the ruler who treats the state like it's a living organism and manages it accordingly, where they basically allow things to happen naturally. Like they establish themselves as the leader, they establish their power over the state, and then they don't have to micromanage it. And that's the way of the leader in this incredibly Machiavellian, you would say vulgarly speaking, master morality outlook, applying Taoism to say like the true leader uses wei wu wei. You shouldn't have to be like imposing your power on the time is a sign of a weak leader. That's actually what Machiavelli says as well, that you should, when you're establishing a new principality, you should establish your power quickly and then use a light touch, and it should be fine. Yeah, if you're constantly having to like crack down, that's not the sign of a good leader, of a stable regime. And so I think a lot of the Taoist insights can be very useful. And yeah, the connections to Nietzsche, I just thought of a better passage. It would be the Tao Te Ching, like the second one, where Lao Tzu is saying, you know, back always follows front, top and bottom depend on one another. Uh, East and west require one another in order to be useful directions. Like basically every duality, every dichotomy that we set up is only meaningful with relation to the opposite pole. Like you can't talk about hot or cold. Like hot and cold are relative scale, right? There is no absolute hot, there is no absolute cold. Well, there is absolute zero, but Lao Tzu didn't know about that. But what is cold to in the normal experience of like temperatures that a human being has, what is cold, relatively speaking, right? Cold relative to a Siberian person, somebody who's native of Siberia, is going to be very different to what somebody from my state of Texas would consider to be cold. So it's like these are all relative scales that depend on one another and therefore are not true dichotomies, or rather, that true dichotomies, rather than being mutually exclusive, are actually mutually inclusive. It's a very odd thought, but it's very similar to Deleuze's differential ontology as well. And so I think a lot of people have noticed that in Lao Tzu. And again, to name drop Professor Muller again, when I talked to him, we kind of agreed. We think a lot of that comes from Heraclitus. That's why Heraclitus has also been noticed to be very similar to a lot of the Taoists and to the Tao Te Ching. Heraclitus's fragments and the Tao Te Ching are very similar documents in many ways, although there are important differences between them that I think might show why people tend to take a very, sort of peace and love, go with the flow thing from Taoism, whereas Heraclitus has some more, he's got those passages like the people should fight to defend their law, just like they fight to defend their city walls. Strife is justice and war is the father of all, and so on and so forth. So Heraclitus is a bit more about seeing the conflict and the aggression and hostility of the phenomenal world, whereas Lao Tzu is more focusing on the ways in which everything works in sort of an invisible, harmonious correspondence with one another. And those are both true, by the way. So it's valuable to learn both. Somebody says snow is cold. That is true. God, I can't wait for it to be cold, guys. I really can't. All right, I'm going to stop answering questions. I've been doing this for a while. I'm going to start wrapping it up here. It's been fun, guys. I've enjoyed this immensely. I like speaking off the cuff. Obviously, I can't always put forward my thoughts with the same level of clarity and articulation as I can when I'm doing a podcast with notes. And, we're just kind of bouncing from topic to topic. We're just kind of going, we're just kind of having fun here. So, if I said something that, or like expressed an idea that you don't fully understand, leave a comment. And once the video's up and it's archived and you can leave comments, and maybe I'll respond to you. Maybe I'll respond to it in a future video. But for the most part, this is just for fun. And I just wanted to kind of touch base with everybody and put out a video for everybody 2 days before I depart for tour. It's not going to be super long. It's going to be like 12 days, but I'm not getting back until the end of the month. So I'm kind of not checking out from podcast world, but I have to have everything lined up, all my videos lined up before I leave, and they're going to schedule them to release, even for like the week after, because, the last show's on Sunday on the 27th, but that's in Fayetteville, Arkansas. I have no idea like when I'm going to get back, presumably in the next couple days, but I don't really have to be back. And it's something of a drive. And the other guitarist, she lives in Dallas. So we're probably going to like drive back to her house and like spend the night there and probably like hang out and do all that kind of thing. And so I'm not sure when I'll be back. So that's all just like a long-winded way of saying, I don't want to I always have to like set things up for the whole time I'm gone. And then like the week after that, because the week I get back, if I jump into like, oh, I'm back on Monday and I have to have a video out on Tuesday, it's not going to happen. Or, it's not going to be a good quality video. So I have some interesting stuff coming out for Halloween. I have a conversation on Untimely Reflections that's coming out with my buddy Mina. He's got a channel called Sharper Pen Image Consulting. I believe he is in the chat as well. And then I've also got a video coming out about, or a podcast about, Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan. I was going to bump that back to the next leg of the season, but I was like, this has to come out on the week of Halloween. It's The Great God Pan. It's one of these great stories. But I there's like a sort of a logic, like with the way the podcast has been going, right? We've been doing all these ancient Greek tragedies and then things on madness like Foucault and Jung and then Donna Tartt's Secret History. And I was like, this is the perfect time to cover some weird fiction. And it's weird fiction, horror fiction about like warping reality, distinction between truth and fiction, people being driven mad by their pursuit of the truth. And Arthur Machen, I mean, it's like Stephen King called The Great God Pan the best horror story in the English language, which I don't think it is. There are some flaws to it, but that being said, it's just so on topic for what we're talking about, and it's a horror tale. So covering it during Halloween, I decided to produce one of the regular episodes about that. Or rather, that was always part of the point, but it was going to be later. I'm like, I'm going to move this up to Halloween. So I'm going to have 2 episodes come out on that week. So we'll have 2 kind of weird fiction stories that we'll talk about. And yeah, so if you've read The Great God Pan, look forward to that. If you haven't read it, you can find it online, and it's a wonderful story that you can read in like a day. So I'd highly recommend that. Other than that, we're getting back into the gay science walkthrough, which is coming out soon. The part 6, first part of book 2. And what else do I have? I may appear on a couple other channels soon. I've been appearing on, I've done a couple other podcasts recently, and I'm scheduling another conversation with our old friend Veldgeist. And I think the topic that we're going to choose will be very, I think it'll be very well received. A lot of people, I think, will be very excited about it. It's something that, it's a particular work of fiction that both him and I enjoy very, very much. And in fact, it's the topic of one of the most popular videos on the channel, the Nietzsche podcast channel. So that's what's coming up for me. Oh, and as far as touring goes as well, I will, of course, if you haven't followed me on X, it's Untimely Salts. And I'll be posting pictures, videos, all sorts of things. I usually like to make a couple shorts while I'm out on the road. I don't know why. I think it's fun to like just be in some random, because normally I'm not on camera when I'm podcasting. It's fun for me to just do a little thing on camera where I'm like walking around in like some random state or city talking about Nietzsche. I like them all being in different places. Maybe I'll live stream from the road or do something like that. I've always thought about doing that. But no matter what, I'm going to have documentation of it. I'll have like another tour movie at the end of it. So if you want to see what my life is like when I'm out doing this kind of thing, those are kind of like passion projects. It's like the least popular thing I do on the channel is show videos of the tour life. But for me, it's art. For me, it's like a creative passion. So enjoy it or don't, you're getting it. So thank you for joining me, everybody. I should probably get going and start thinking about rustling up some food. Yeah, this has been a Nietzsche podcast live stream. Happy Halloween, everyone, and happy Nietzsche's birthday on October 15th, Nietzsche Day. Signing off.